They came at dawn like a living storm, a sea of hooves, dust, and iron swallowing the horizon, the Mongol Empire at the height of its power, undefeated from China to the edge of Europe. But on the burning plains of the Indian subcontinent, something happened that no Mongol scout, no Chinese chronicler, no Persian poet ever prepared them for. An invisible line of death they could not cross, a weapon they could not outrun, and a humiliation so profound it would be buried beneath centuries of silence. Tonight on Moonlight Science, we're not just telling the story of that weapon. Born in the furnaces and forges of medieval India, honed by generations of forgotten engineers and warrior saints, we are reconstructing how a single, ingenious Indian invention shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and rewrote the physics of the battlefield. And somewhere deep in this tale of steel, thunder, and fire lies a final twist. That the true power of this weapon was never in its metal at all, but in a terrifying idea that still shapes how we fight wars today. The heat over the North Indian Plain feels almost alive. It wriggles above the cracked earth in shimmering waves, bending the horizon, turning trees and huts into wavering ghosts. Dust hangs in the air, fine as flour, clinging to tongues and eyelashes. By mid-morning, every breath already feels like inhaling from an oven. The village at the edge of this plain has seen too much of war. Its mud walls lean, its thatch sags from old monsoons. Today, though, it's not the memory of rain that has everyone's attention. It's the sound. Faint at first. A tremor in the ground, a vibration felt in bare soles. Chickens go silent. Dogs lift their heads, ears pricked, then slink under carts. Children stop mid-game, sensing the way adults suddenly hold themselves. The tremor becomes a murmur. The murmur grows. On the northern horizon, a dark smear appears, low and thin at first, then thickening as if some giant hand is dragging charcoal across the sky. Above it, like black knives, banners stab into the light, the Tamgus of Mongol clans. The stories have preceded them by years. Tales of cities in far-off lands emptied in days, of princes who fled, of fields left littered with bones. Most of it sounds too terrible when whispered at a cooking fire. Nothing sounds impossible when you see the dust they throw. Villagers scramble. A woman grabs her children and a sack of grain in one motion, shoving them toward back paths. An old man tries to lift a bundle too heavy, drops it, and simply runs. A boy stands frozen, clutching a clay toy until a stranger's hand yanks him into motion. Beyond the last huts, the land rises gently, then rolls down toward the oncoming cloud. On that low ridge, in the white glare, a line of figures waits. From a distance, they don't look like much. No elephants loom there, no armored giants stamping and trumpeting. There is no glittering wedge of cavalry moving to meet the flanks of the swarm. No forest of spears at a bristling angle. Just men. A thin band of them, many kneeling, some standing, all disturbingly still. Each cluster of 2, 3, or 4 men is gathered around an object planted in the dirt. A short, thick tube of iron or bronze lashed to a crude wooden frame. The metal is darkened from heat and age, flecked with rust. Near the sealed rear of each tube, a tiny vent has been drilled. Around them, the ground is scorched in irregular patches. Faces are smeared with dust. Turbans are tied tight. Hands move with ritual economy. Powder tipped from flasks into scoops, poured into muzzles, rammed down. Wads of cloth, a rounded stone or iron ball seated with a dull thud. Another wad, more ramming. Everything tamped, sealed, made ready. The sound of hooves is clear now, a rolling thunder pressing on the chest. The oncoming mass resolves. Squat, muscular horses. Men in lamellar and leather, bows in hand, spare mounts trailing. Mongol cavalry. They slow slightly at the sight of no walls, no heavy shock troops, only this ragged line with odd metal stumps. To their eyes, this isn't a threat. It's a gift. Infantry in the open are corpses that don't know it yet. On the ridge, an Indian officer walks the line. Beard, sword, narrowed eyes. At each tube he checks charges, shot, and the smoldering lengths of match cord ready in calloused fingers. Remember your mark? Wait for my sign. He says over and over. Arrows begin to drop in. One finds a leg. A gunner grunts, then finishes tamping before being helped aside. Others hiss into the dirt. The Mongols shift from canter to gallop. Dust boils around their horses' legs. Bows rise. The script they've used from China to the edge of Europe is about to play again. A storm of arrows, peel away, repeat until nothing stands. The officer lifts his sword. Time thins. Match cords hover a breath above touch holes. The front rank of horses is close enough now that you can see the whites of their eyes, the individual plates on armor, the faint curl of riders' lips. The sword drops. Match cords plunge, fibers blacken, then burst into orange sparks that race into the vents. There is a snake-like hiss, and the plane detonates. Dozens of tubes erupt almost together. Fire punches from the muzzles in jagged tongues. A wall of concussive sound slams outward, sharper and angrier than any storm. Smoke billows in greasy, fast-rolling clouds, swallowing the lower bodies of the oncoming riders. Projectiles are invisible in flight. They appear only as impact. A horse's chest caves in. It folds and throws its rider into a tangle of limbs and dust. Grape shot shreds another's forelegs, sending it crashing sideways into its neighbor. A ball slams into a saddlebow. The rider spins and spills, clutching at reins that suddenly have no order. Even where iron meets no flesh, the blast works. Horses rear and twist from the pressure and the stink. The once smooth front collapses into gaps and knots as animals collide or balk. Arrows loosed an instant before the blast fly wild. Some sail high, some drop short. Some are never released. Hands fly from bowstrings to clamp over ears, to grab for saddles on bucking mounts. Behind their tubes, the gunners are already reloading through the smoke, ears ringing, arms aching. On the plain below, men and horses crumple, killed not by anything they saw in the air, but by a force that struck faster than sight. For the first time, the horde has met an enemy it cannot read in time. The northern marches of the Delhi Sultanate are not a line on a map. They're a wound. Mongol raiders push through the passes like recurring fever. Punjab is hammered again and again. Fields burned, canals smashed, forts ruined, towns abandoned, rebuilt, burned. From the south and east, rival Indian powers and internal rebellions strain Delhi's resources. Here, peace just means the Mongols are raiding somewhere else this season. Delhi itself is a hybrid fortress. Persian-speaking court, Turkic and Afghan nobles, Indian administrators, mixed armies. Its stone walls and citadels are a precarious shield between the Mongol storm and the packed heartland along the Ganges. Under that constant threat, ideas behave differently. Old tactics, elephants in front, cavalry wings, infantry blocks, keep failing against the same opponent. Scorched earth and fortress defense preserve the core, but bleed the frontier white. Everyone knows this is not sustainable. So a new question takes shape in the minds of commanders, smiths, and alchemists. If we can't beat the Mongols at their own game of speed and archery, can we change the game itself? To see how radical that is, we need to grasp the monster they're facing. The Mongol army is a complete ecosystem. Small, durable horses, composite bows lethal beyond normal ranges, riders who have been shooting at full gallop since childhood. Units are organized in tens, hundreds, thousands, with ruthless discipline. Their tactics, feigned retreats, encirclements, hit-and-run raids, turn battlefields into fluid, shifting traps. Their herds travel with them, so they don't need long supply lines. Scouts, merchants, and informants map enemy lands years in advance. They know where food, rivers, and weak walls are before they arrive. They don't just win battles. They make whole regions feel that resistance is pointless. On the Indian side, the Delhi Sultanate commands elephants, armored cavalry, and deep infantry ranks. Perfect for crushing local rivals, less perfect for catching a moving storm. Elephants panic under arrow swarms. Heavy foot soldiers can't force the Mongols to stand and fight. Even the Sultanate's own steppe-style cavalry is outclassed by the Mongols' more refined system. The result is a stalemate of misery. Delhi doesn't fall, but its borderlands are shredded. This is the forgotten war zone our story inhabits. A place where courage alone isn't enough, and where survival begins to depend on something far more volatile. Men in hidden workshops, playing with powders and iron and asking a dangerous question. What if the space between us and them could be weaponized in a completely new way? In the next chapter, we'll step into that Indian world in more detail and watch how a long, quiet relationship with fire begins to twist toward thunder. To understand why the thunder on that ridge mattered, we have to stare straight at what it struck. The Mongols did not appear as just another raiding tribe with horses and big dreams. By the time their scouts looked down into the passes toward India, they carried behind them a record that felt, to contemporaries, like proof of divine favor. At the core of their power was a simple fusion: horse and bow. Their horses were small, shaggy, and unremarkable to foreign eyes, but bred for endurance. They grazed on rough steppe grass, survived winter nights in the open, and could be ridden hard day after day. Each warrior brought several mounts, rotating them to keep his mobility high when other cavalry would be blown. The bow he carried was no simple wooden arc. It was a composite weapon: wood, horn, and sinew layered and glued under tension, then sealed. Short enough to fire from horseback, strong enough to send an armor-piercing arrow hundreds of meters. Mongol riders could loose accurately at full gallop in almost any direction. Forward, sideways, even backward during a retreat. From childhood, boys learned to ride and shoot as one skill. By the time they joined a unit, the motion of knocking, drawing, and releasing at speed was as natural to them as walking is to us. Multiply that by tens of thousands. Organization amplified individual skill. The Mongols used a decimal structure: squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, tumens of 10,000. Each had appointed leaders, and discipline was ferocious. Breaking formation or disobeying orders could mean death. Not just for you, but for your comrades, if commanders chose to make an example. On the battlefield, this produced something eerily modern: coordinated maneuvers over large distances. Feigned retreats weren't random panic, they were scripted moves. A vanguard would approach, shower an enemy with arrows, then wheel and flee. If the enemy broke ranks to chase, other units, waiting on the flanks, would crash in, while the retreating band suddenly turned to shoot into the confusion. Again and again, across China, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. That pattern worked. Their logistics looked like magic to sedentary states. They moved with herds instead of grain carts, consuming milk, meat, and blood on the march. They could cross deserts and frozen rivers where other armies would starve or bog down. Winter, which grounded many foes, often became their preferred campaign season. Information was another weapon. Before big offensives, Mongol leaders sent merchants, spies, and envoys into target regions years in advance. They cataloged roads, fortresses, rivers, rulers, rivalries. They knew where to hit and where it would hurt most. When they attacked, it often felt to defenders as if the enemy already knew the country better than they did. Terror was not incidental. It was policy. Cities that resisted were sometimes annihilated. Populations slaughtered or enslaved, survivors left as a warning. Towns that surrendered early could be spared the worst. Stories of these fates raced ahead of their banners, turning rumor into a second army that arrived long before the first hoofbeats. Put all of this together and you get why. From the Jin dynasty to Khwarizm to Kievan Rus, the Mongols seemed less like an army and more like a natural disaster. Fast, inexorable, resistant to local tricks. You could win a skirmish here or there. You could hide in strong fortresses. But meeting them in open battle and winning decisively? That looked, to many, like suicide. And this is the force that now rides toward the Indian line, with the tubes. From their saddles, looking up at that thin ridge under a white sky, the pattern must feel familiar. Another frontier force. Another group of desperate defenders trying to stand in the path of a system honed across continents. They expect the same story to play out. Shock, arrows, broken infantry, pursuit, plunder. Instead, they're about to discover that someone in this new land has stopped trying to outride them and started tampering with the physics of fear itself. In the next chapter, we'll turn fully to India's side of the hill. A landscape of elephants, forts, alchemists, and a long, quiet intimacy with fire that made thunder and iron possible. To the Mongols, the land beyond the Hindu Kush was more rumor than map. Stories of wealth, rivers that swelled like seas, and cities older than memory. On the ground, that edge was brutal and real. North India in this era is a layered world. The Himalayas loom to the north, their meltwater feeding the Indus, Ganges, and Yamuna. These rivers carve broad plains, flooding and shifting, leaving behind belts of rich soil where cities sprout like hardy weeds. Brick and stone walls ring Lahore, Multan, Delhi, and dozens of lesser strongholds. Within, streets choke with merchants, artisans, priests, and soldiers. The Delhi Sultanate presides over much of this north, but its rule is far from absolute. It is a stitched-together realm, Turkic and Afghan elites atop an older Indian society, Persian in its court language, Indian in its labor, Islamic in its ideology, yet surrounded by Hindu and mixed polities. Southward, powerful kingdoms in the Deccan and further down the peninsula pursue their own ambitions, only loosely connected to Delhi's fate. Militarily, Delhi draws on a deep arsenal of subcontinental warcraft. The most iconic symbol is the war elephant, a living tower. Armored in chain and plate, tusks tipped with iron, its back bearing archers and javelin men. An elephant charge can tear open a line like a plow through soil. Infantry, spearmen, swordsmen, archers, are massed into dense formations, often with large shields and regional weapons honed over centuries. Cavalry, including Turkic and Afghan horsemen, add mobility and shock. Against other Indian states, this system works. Elephants and heavy cavalry crush lightly equipped foes. Siegecraft and walls decide long conflicts. Victory is often a matter of bravery, numbers, and divine favor, as interpreted by court chroniclers. But this logic frays at the edges where the Mongols test it. Elephants, so terrifying to men, are animals of nerve and habit. Under a storm of accurate arrows from fast-moving horse archers, their trunks and eyes become targets. A few well-placed shafts can turn these giants into blind, enraged battering rams that trample friendly troops. Infantry, trudging in armor through heat and dust, struggle to force Mongols into a stand-up fight. The Mongols simply refuse the engagement, hovering at arrow range, burning and receding. Even Delhi's elite cavalry finds itself a step behind. They are fierce, individually skilled, but their organization, doctrine, and lifelong immersion in horseback archery are not as ruthlessly tuned as the Mongols. What worked against previous steppe and highland enemies now meets a version of that craft taken to its logical extreme. The Sultanate responds, as states often do, under a new kind of pressure. By doing more of what it knows. More fortifications, more elephants, more cavalry musters. It works, but only to a point. The Mongols raid into Punjab, burn, loot, retreat. Delhi holds, but at the cost of sacrificing its borderlands repeatedly. In this liminal zone, neither secure interior nor fully lost, what it means to defend India begins to quietly change. Defense stops being just a matter of brave men and thick walls. It becomes, for some, a problem of design. How do you stop an enemy who will not stand where you can hit him? How do you wound a rider beyond the reach of your arrows and lances? How do you turn the very space between him and you into a weapon? India's long familiarity with metal, stone, and fire means the raw materials of an answer are already present. What's missing is the decision to combine them in a way no one has yet dared. That decision is coming. For many polities on the Mongol frontier, the story is simple and devastating. Contact, campaign, collapse. The Delhi Sultanate refuses to collapse, but it doesn't win either. It survives in a way that feels like a long, controlled fall. The first Mongol incursions into Punjab are like knives probing an old scar. They take towns, test fortresses, burn fields. Lahore, once a jewel, becomes a byword for repeated violation. Some years it is in Delhi's hands, other years under threat or half-ruined, its people scattered. Each raid forces Delhi to choose what to save and what to sacrifice. When word arrives, dust plumes in the northwest, caravans turned back, refugees streaming in. Orders go out. Border villages are told to empty and move deeper inland. Granaries near likely paths are stripped. What can't be moved is burned. Wells are fouled, bridges cut. It is a grim arithmetic. Better our own fields burn now than feed the horses that will come to kill us. The policy works in strategic terms. Mongol raiders pushing into Punjab find stretches of hostile emptiness. Their horses struggle to graze. Their men tire of chasing phantom defenders through stripped bare lands. When they push too close to Delhi itself, they meet real resistance. Strong walls, concentrated forces, a capital that's turned its outer ring into controlled ruin to save its core. But every successful defense leaves scars. Farmers see their own crops set alight by order of distant rulers. Small towns are emptied so often that rebuilding feels like a joke. Trade routes flicker in and out of existence with each new incursion. Soldiers, marched repeatedly to the same burning fields, begin to feel they are bleeding just to keep the map from shrinking. At court, the anxiety is palpable. Chroniclers record Mongol forces appearing within sight of Delhi's environs more than once, stirring panic. There are debates over flight versus stand, emergency tax levies, purges of suspected traitors. Sultans like Alauddin Khalji tie their legitimacy in part to their ability to keep the horde out. But they know privately how thin the margin is. In the long intervals between crises, something harder than fear begins to crystallize. A realization that this pattern cannot go on indefinitely. You can burn your own fields only so many times. You can ask border populations to uproot themselves only so often before they stop coming back. In that atmosphere, a different kind of thought gains traction. If cavalry and elephants and walls in their current form cannot defeat the Mongols, perhaps some other tool can at least cripple their advantage. Not more men, but a different idea. A weapon that doesn't care how fast a horse runs or how many arrows a rider can loose. Something that punishes approach itself. This is not a clean, sudden epiphany. It's a slow, uncomfortable drift in councils and workshops. Generals begin to tolerate strange demonstrations by artisans with smoky contraptions. Resources, iron, saltpeter, labor, are allocated to experiments that might otherwise have been dismissed as dangerous toys. Underneath the official narratives of valor and divine favor, a quieter story is unfolding. A state pressed to its limits, slowly admitting that it must gamble on something new or die by inches. When the first thunder tubes roar on a ridge, they are not a miracle from nowhere. They are the audible proof that Delhi chose to be something rarer than simply undefeated. It chose to learn. Long before fire was packed into tubes to kill horses, India had been coaxing flame into doing strange things. In temple courtyards, festivals already sparkled with pyrotechnics. Wheels of fire, rockets hissing into the night, showers of sparks that made crowds gasp. In mines and quarries, workers had begun using combustible mixtures to crack stubborn rock, saving days of hammering. In alchemical texts, Rasa Shastra, recipes recorded how certain minerals, when combined and ignited, flared, roared, or shattered containers. Saltpeter was not a theoretical substance. It crusted the soil in certain regions, harvested as earth salt. Charcoal from various woods, sulfur from trade routes, these were all known to artisans and scholars. Early mixtures of these ingredients produced everything from slow-burning fuses to violent flashes. Most of this stayed within 3 domains: religion, entertainment, and mining. Temple engineers wanted controlled wonder. They timed explosions to coincide with ritual climaxes, routing fire and water through hidden channels to impress both peasants and princes. Miners and quarry masters, by contrast, wanted power aimed inward, blasts that widened cracks in rock or toppled stone blocks. Alchemists chased transformations, turning ore to metal, plants to pigments, base matter to something more exalted. Yet in all these uses, a theme emerged. Confinement multiplies force. An open flame can dazzle, but a sealed charge can shatter a pot, bulge a metal hoop, or send a lid flying. Men who handled these mixtures learned respect the hard way, gaining scars and caution. They noticed how much more violent a reaction became when it was forced to push against walls before escaping. Somewhere in this ecosystem, a different question formed. If a blast can break rock or fling a lid, could it also throw something on purpose? We don't know who first put that thought into metal. It could have been a temple engineer tired of misdirected rockets, a miner curious about pushing debris instead of just breaking walls, or a military artificer playing with scare weapons for siege defense. What we know is that by the time the Mongols were pressing Delhi's borders, the raw conceptual ingredients for a gun were already scattered across Indian practice. Tubes of iron and bronze existed for other tasks. Bells, pipes, temple infrastructure, hydraulic devices. Explosive knowledge was present in alchemical circles and practical trades. Texts and travelers had likely brought in hints of Chinese fire lances and rockets, and of Middle Eastern experiments with Chinese snow, saltpeter. Under ordinary circumstances, this might have remained a rich but compartmentalized tradition. Under Mongol pressure, the compartments began to leak into each other. What happens when a bellcaster meets an alchemist? What happens when a temple engineer who has watched crowds flinch at a festival blast is called to consult on fort defense. What happens when a sultan, desperate for any edge, orders his arsenals to show me everything that makes noise and frightens men? The answers play out not in palaces, but in the dark, smoky rooms at their edges. Workshops where fire is already a familiar, dangerous companion. There, sparks in the dark finally start to point in a new direction, outward, toward the enemy. The stage is set for someone to realize that fire doesn't just have to crack stone or paint the sky. It can be trained. Imagine the first attempt. An ironworker used to casting Bell's eyes, a rejected piece of pipe, too flawed for water, too ugly for a temple. An alchemist brings him a powder that doesn't just burn, but bursts. A commander, skeptical but curious, says, "Can you make it roar in one direction?" They start simple. A metal pot sealed with a lid, packed with powder and small stones, fuse inserted. Lit at a distance, it detonates with a deafening crack, flinging shrapnel in all directions. It scares everyone and injures a couple of onlookers. Impressive, but wild. The key insight is geometric. A pot explodes outward evenly. A tube, if strong enough, can force the blast along its length. So the pot becomes a cylinder, short, thick-walled, one end sealed, the other open. A small vent is drilled near the back. Into the open mouth goes a measured charge of powder, tamped with a wad. Above that, a stone or iron lump, another wad. The tube is wedged at an angle in the earth, fuse inserted. The first firing is a mess of fear and curiosity. Everyone stands further back than they need to. The fuse spits and hisses down into the vent. For a moment, nothing. Then the world jolts. Fire punches from the muzzle. The tube kicks backward, biting into its supports. A cloud of smoke rolls out. A heartbeat later, downrange, a target, a wooden plank, a mud wall, shatters as if hit by an invisible hammer. The stone, which no man could throw that far with any force, has arrived like a fist. It may have tumbled, it may have struck off center, but it got there faster and harder than anything they've seen leave a human hand. From that moment on, refinement is inevitable. Charges are adjusted. Too much powder and the tube bulges or bursts, endangering the crew. Too little, and the projectile lobs pathetically. Wads are improved to seal gases better, increasing pressure and range. Tubes are shortened or lengthened. Some experiments fail spectacularly. Iron splits like a rotten fruit, sending jagged metal tearing backward. Men are hurt. Lessons are learned. Terminology lags behind function. Chronicles will later mention fire tubes, roaring mouths, iron thunderers. To users, they are temperamental beasts, sometimes obedient, sometimes treacherous. At first, they are likely used as siege noisemakers and scare weapons on walls. Fired down into attackers, they cause casualties and panic. But the men who operate them also see something else. The predictable arc of a projectile, the repeatable reaction when angle and charge are held constant. Fire, confined, is beginning to look like a tool that can be pointed. Rumors of such devices, or cruder cousins, already exist elsewhere. Chinese fire lances, Middle Eastern pot bombs, and early cannon. But what is taking shape here is tailored to an Indian context. Short, robust tubes that can be moved, braced, and fired not just from walls, but from open ground. A weapon that doesn't need a fortress beneath it. A weapon that might, one day soon, stand on a ridge and meet a cavalry charge head-on. If the blast is the soul of the thunder tube, the barrel is its fragile body. And in India, shaping metal was already an old, refined art. Indian smiths had long produced crucible steel, woods, famed for blades that could hold a keen edge and resist breaking. Massive iron pillars had stood for centuries in temple complexes without rusting to dust. Bells cast for shrines rang with specific, tuned notes. Metal, in other words, was something Indians didn't just use. They listened to it. Turning that expertise to containing an explosion was a different challenge. Early tubes made by wrapping and forge welding iron strips around a core revealed hidden flaws brutally. Under pressure, weak seams split. Slag inclusions became crack starters. A burst barrel could peel back like petals, shredding nearby flesh. Each failure was a horror and a data point. Smiths responded as experimenters always do, by varying inputs. Wall thickness increased at the breach, where pressure was highest. Transitions from thick to thin were made more gradual. Better iron, more uniform, fewer impurities, was reserved for barrels. In richer arsenals, bronze was tried. Molten metal poured into clay and wax molds, producing a more homogeneous structure. Bronze was expensive but predictable, less likely to conceal deadly internal faults. Testing moved from ad hoc to systematic. Tubes were overcharged deliberately in controlled trials beyond city walls. Those that survived known abuse were trusted more in battle. Those that failed were cut open, their fractures studied. Where did the cracks start? Along a seam? At a thin spot? Near a bubble? Smiths and gunners developed folk diagnostics. A sound barrel, when struck lightly, rang true. One with hidden flaws might give a dull, complex note. The feel of the metal under the file, the way it sparked when ground, all these became signs. Slowly, unreliable oddities became dependable tools. As confidence grew, design diversified. Some tubes stayed small enough to be lifted by a few men and braced on a low frame, flexible for field use. Others grew larger, intended for walls and gates. A few massive bombards emerged, capable of hurling great stones at fortifications. But a key priority in the Delhi frontier context remained: robustness under frequent firing. These weren't ceremonial guns to be fired once in a festival. They would need to bark again and again as raiders approached. In this interplay of blast and barrel, a threshold was crossed. Once tubes could be counted on not to betray their crews most of the time, commanders started to think of them not as risky curiosities, but as something they could stake a battle plan on. The iron now spoke fire's language well enough to become its trusted throat. Gunpowder's story doesn't belong to any one culture. It's a web of parallel discoveries, borrowings, and adaptations. Chinese alchemists had discovered explosive mixtures centuries earlier while searching for immortality elixirs, recording fire medicines that corroded and flared. Military innovators in Song China turned those into fire lances, rockets, and early bombs. Recipes specifying proportions of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur began to circulate in technical manuals. From there, knowledge seeped along the same routes that carried silk and ideas. In the Islamic world, scholars and engineers experimented with Chinese snow, saltpeter, in incendiaries, rockets, and stone-throwing guns. Arabic and Persian texts record formulas for potent mixtures and devices that blurred the line between flame and projectile. The Delhi Sultanate sat right in the middle of these currents. Its rulers and officers were culturally plugged into Persian and Central Asian networks. Scholars and artisans moved between Herat, Isfahan, Samarkand, and Delhi. Caravans passing through North India carried not just spices and cloth, but stories of strange weapons. Tubes that spat fire in Syria, rockets in China, pot bombs in Anatolia. When such hints reached Indian ears, they landed on fertile ground. Local alchemists already had their own recipes. miners, and festival makers already handled explosive mixes. Saltpeter was plentiful in the soils of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. Charcoal and sulfur were widely available. Indian experimenters didn't simply copy foreign ratios. They tweaked. Higher saltpeter content increased the violence of combustion. Different charcoals changed burn speed. Grain size reforms changed how fast powder burned and how pressure built. Recipes were tuned not for Chinese bamboo tubes or specific Middle Eastern bombards, but for the heavy iron and bronze tubes Indian smiths were making, and for the goals Indian commanders had. Those goals were shaped by geography and threat. In much of Eurasia, early guns focused on smashing fortifications, walls, gates, towers. In India's northwest, the immediate nightmare was mobile cavalry. So Indian versions of gunpowder and gun design trended toward concussive, short to medium-range blasts optimized to tear into masked riders and their mounts, not just to crack stone. Did India reinvent gunpowder independently, or absorb it and transform it? The likely answer is both. Ideas about mixtures and effects probably traveled in. The particular weapons that roared on that ridge were, in their proportions and purpose, locally grown. By the time Mongol hooves thickened the air with dust, gunpowder in India was no longer a festival trick or a mining tool alone. It was being actively nurtured as something else. A way to make the empty space in front of an army dangerous in a way no arrow could match. If you watch enough Mongol raids, a brutal clarity settles in. The real engine of their power isn't just the man. It's the horse. A Mongol warrior on foot is still dangerous, but he is no longer a ghost that appears, kills, and vanishes before you can swing twice. Everything that makes the horde terrifying, their reach, their speed, their ability to feint and regroup, flows through the legs and heart of 1,000 small, tireless mounts. Indian commanders and engineers learned to see the battlefield in those terms. The question stopped being, how do we kill more Mongols, and became, how do we break the charge by breaking the relationship between rider and mount? The Thunder Tube was the perfect lens for that question. In training grounds, gunners and officers studied where horses' bodies occupied space during a gallop. Chest height, leg positions, the density of riders in a charge. They didn't have slow-motion cameras, but they had eyes and experience. They watched their own cavalry and sketched mental models. Projectiles were chosen and packed accordingly. Heavy, single balls could punch through a horse's chest and into the rider behind. Bundles of smaller shot wrapped in cloth that burst out of the muzzle created a spreading fan of metal and stone at about the height of fetlocks and knees. Wads were tuned to ensure this lethal swarm didn't leave the barrel too soon or too late. Barrel angles were marked to send this storm into the right vertical band, not too high, where it would fly over, not too low, where it would plow uselessly into dirt. Ranges were marked on the ground or in men's memories, so crews knew. At this distance, with this angle, we're cutting into legs and lower chests. Then there was sound and smoke. Horses are prey animals. Their sensory systems are wired to react to sudden, loud noises and strange smells with flight, not analysis. A blast from a thunder tube sends a pressure wave into their sensitive ears, a shock through their skulls, and a gust of stinging smoke into their nostrils. Even a physically uninjured horse can decide, in that moment, that forward is death. Indian planners understood, if not in scientific jargon, then in practical fact, that this was part of the weapon. A volley from multiple tubes, timed to hit just as a charge committed to full speed, could trigger panic at the front. One hesitating or collapsing horse becomes an obstacle. 2 become a hazard. 10 become a cascading disaster for everyone behind. The aim was not just casualty counts. It was chain reactions. Riders thrown, horses colliding, ranks bunching and folding. All the graceful, terrifying geometry of a Mongol attack. Those beautiful arcs and crescent formations twisted suddenly into ugly tangles. This is why, when that first line of riders hit the invisible wall on the ridge, the failure felt so total. It wasn't just that some men fell. It was that the entire system they depended on for coherence, speed, formation, mutual confidence between man and beast, was ambushed at the level of biology. The thunder tubes hadn't just been built to kill. They had been built to induce chaos in the one thing the Mongols could not fight without. Before that big showdown on the plain, there must have been smaller, quieter trials where theory met reality. Picture 1. A Mongol raiding party, maybe 100 strong, crests a low rise as the sun drops. Below them, they spot what looks like a poorly defended village. A few huts, some fields, a small shrine. Easier still, a line of what appear to be local troops. No walls behind them, no elephants. They've hit scenes like this dozens of times. The script writes itself. Advance in loose order. Pepper the line with arrows. Watch peasants and militia scatter. Run down the slow and the brave. Take what can be carried. Burn the rest. They start down. At the edge of the village, Indian officers and a handful of gunners watch them come. These men have fired their tubes from walls and practice grounds. They've seen shots shatter timber targets, have felt the blast in their teeth. But they've never yet stood in an open field with only a shallow earthwork between them and steppe cavalry. Fear is tangible. Still they hold. The Mongols close, bows halfway drawn. At a prearranged point, perhaps near a marker stone hammered into the earth, the Indian officer raises his arm and shouts. Match cords drop into vents. The first volley is ragged. A few fuses burn too slow, a few too fast. Several tubes cough weakly as damp powder misbehaves. But enough charges ignite properly. Thunder rolls out over the stubble. Smoke shrouds the front of the line. Downrange, dust leaps where shot lands. One pair of riders goes down in a tangle of horse and man, a chest punched through. Another mount, struck in the foreleg, screams and collapses, flipping its rider. Around them, uninjured animals rear from the blast, throwing off aim and timing. To a Mongol commander looking for normal patterns, this is wrong. The enemy did not advance, did not crumple under arrows, did not do anything visible to cause this disruption. The horses simply faltered. He could press on, chalking it up to bad luck. But from his vantage, he sees the formation loosening, men looking sideways, mounts dancing in agitation. The line he expected to carve through with elegant motions is starting to look jagged. He calls a retreat, not because he's taken massive casualties, but because the charge has already lost its shape. From the Indian side, the victory seems small. A few dead, a raiding party turned aside. But the implications are enormous. Something they did, these smoky tubes, made Mongol horsemen back away before they reached spear range. For commanders, this is data. For gunners, it is confidence. For the Mongols who rode away with their ears still ringing and their horses shying at random noises for days, it is something else. The first, unnerving sense that an enemy has found a way to pluck at the nerves of their mounts from afar. A rumor is born. One lucky skirmish cannot win a war. The Delhi Sultanate knows this. The first successful field use of thunder tubes is treated not as proof of a miracle, but as a proof of concept. That means drills. Outside Delhi and other major forts, stretches of land are cleared and marked. Targets, stacked earth, wooden frames, straw dummies, are set at measured distances. Gunners haul out their tubes, not under the adrenaline of near death, but under the dry eye of officers with wax tablets or palm leaf notebooks. They fire at fixed angles with fixed charges and watch where shot lands. They note how damp days shorten range, how hot days stretch it. They see that doubling the powder doesn't double the distance. At a certain point, it just abuses the barrel and wastes material. They mark carriages or stones with small cuts to record useful elevations. Patterns emerge. At 3 measures of powder and this notch of elevation, the shot tends to land between here and here. At this lower angle, the blast sends grape shot into a tight band close to the ground. If we fire too early, the effect is noise with little harm. If we wait until they are here, the front rank is in the worst of it. Crews practice under simulated attack. Cavalry or runners play the role of charging enemies, while gunners learn to control their panic and wait for the precise moment officers have chosen. Reloading drills emphasize speed without sloppiness. Ram, powder, wad, shot, wad, clear vent, match ready. Commanders begin to rewrite their doctrines around these timings. Rather than push cavalry immediately into contact, they hold them back, letting the tubes fire first. Rather than put infantry in one thick, static block, they arrange them to protect and serve the guns. Shields absorbing arrows while gunners work. Spearmen ready to meet any enemy who reaches the line, shaken but alive. Gradually, the thunder tube is no longer seen as an add-on. It becomes central to the way certain units are arrayed and moved. The men behind the tubes change too. At first, they are drawn from whoever is available and handy with tools. Over time, they coalesce into a distinct group with shared tricks and lore. They know which tubes are good, which prefer slightly less powder, which have a tendency to kick harder. They swap stories of perfect shots, proud scars, close calls. They also start to develop an intuition that goes beyond memorized distances. A sense of how long a gallop takes from that distant marker. How the rhythm of hooves changes as riders commit fully. How many breaths pass between seeing eyes at a certain size and having to fire. It's not mathematics in a book. It's mathematics in the body. And from that embodied knowledge arises something close to a new science. Not of equations, but of cause and effect, of repeatable outcomes. Field physics hidden inside the roar of war. Meanwhile, in the Mongol camps far to the northwest, a different kind of information begins to circulate. It doesn't appear as a formal report at first. It comes as talk. Around night fires, over shared bowls of fermented mare's milk, men who've returned from India speak of an enemy that did something strange. They describe lines of men not running, not charging, but kneeling beside iron objects. They recall a sound that punched the air, unlike any drum or storm. They talk of horses that collapsed without visible arrows in them, of mounts that refused to go forward, eyes rolling white, as if the ground itself had become hateful. Some listeners dismiss it as exaggeration. Every front has its stories. Others file it away uneasily. Their officers try to shape the narrative. In councils, they frame these encounters as minor irritants. The Indians have noisy fire pots, they say. They spook horses, kill a few men. Next time, we'll be ready. Approach from oblique angles. Use more arrows at a distance. Dismount if necessary. But the details don't fit neatly. You can see a wall. You can count archers. You can scout a marsh. You cannot scout a sound. You cannot outflank a pressure wave. For a military culture used to cataloging enemy strengths and absorbing useful elements, this is new. There is nothing to steal easily. You can't capture a thunder tube mid-battle unless you reach it. And the whole point is that it stops you getting there in good order. The more honest commanders murmur among themselves about iron mouths and earth thunder. They send cautious notes up the chain. Beware these devices. They frighten horses. They can break the momentum of a charge. At higher levels, the Empire's chroniclers brush past or minimize these mentions. The overall narrative remains one of dominance. India is a stubborn frontier. Delhi is annoying. But nothing threatens the core. Yet in the mental landscape of individual riders, something starts to shift. The next time they ride toward an Indian line that looks too still, some part of them will remember stories of fire bursting from the ground. Their horses, already conditioned by loud blasts, may need more urging to commit. A half-second of hesitation here, a bad angle there. That's all it takes to turn a perfect Mongol maneuver into a tangle. Terror, carefully cultivated as a weapon they cast ahead of themselves, has sent back a faint echo. The Mongol war machine is not broken. But for the first time, its men are hearing of an enemy whose key weapon isn't just sharper steel or taller walls. It's something that attacks their confidence in the unseen space between armies. The decisive clash doesn't come in a canyon or at a fortress gate. It comes on a broad, open plain, the kind of ground Mongol commanders normally dream about. Their plan is familiar, refined across continents. Light cavalry screens will harass and draw out the enemy. Main bodies will hit where resistance thins. Feigned retreats will tempt rash charges. Arrows will soften and disorder. Then, at the right moment, heavy cavalry wedges will punch through for the kill. Across the field, the Indian army forms up in a shape that, at a glance, seems to invite exactly this. A long front, modest depth, elephants held back, not leading, cavalry on the wings, but not pushed aggressively forward. In the center, behind low banks of earth, the dark shapes of tubes are interspersed among infantry lines. The Mongol chiefs confer, then commit. Skirmishers dash in, loosing arrows at range. A few Indians fall. The line doesn't break or surge. It flexes, shields raised, gunners hunkered. The skirmishers peel away, reporting no major weaknesses. Wedges of cavalry begin to form opposite the Indian center, lances and bows ready. Dust thickens as hooves churn the ground. The signal is given. The wedges roll forward, picking up speed, tightening as they go. Behind the earthworks, drums beat a different code. Indian officers call for calm. Gunners grip match cords, eyes fixed on ground marks rather than men. Infantry brace to protect them. Arrows whistle in at closer range, cutting some defenders down. One tube's crew is half killed before they ever fire. Others slide in to fill the gaps. Then the charge crosses an invisible line, the one laid down in days of practice and counted breaths. The Indian drums change cadence. Swords rise and fall, match cords drop. This time, the volleys are not ragged. Dozens of tubes discharge within heartbeats of each other. The line becomes a jagged, concussive wall. Smoke and flame burst forward, shrouding the defenders, enveloping the oncoming riders. From within the Mongol charge, it is like riding into a storm that wasn't on the horizon a second ago. Horses in the very front meet the worst of it. Some die instantly, others rear and crash. Those just behind pile into them, unable to stop at that speed. Grape shot and balls rip through legs, bellies, lower torsos. Bows drop from hands as riders clutch at saddles or at wounds. The carefully calculated momentum of the wedge collapses. Geometry turns against them. Instead of a sharp point driving into a line, the Mongols find themselves in clumps and gaps. Some riders still pushing forward out of stubbornness or ignorance of what's happening ahead. Others trying to wheel away. Trumpet calls and banner signals vanish into smoke and noise. A second, hastier volley adds to the chaos. Even those untouched by shot feel their mounts buck and shy under the blast. Arrow volleys become sporadic, aim ruined. The Indian side seizes the moment. Infantry surge forward in sections, spears and swords targeting the most disordered pockets. Cavalry, on the wings, held back until now, drive in against the flanks of a force that for once is not in control of its own spacing. The Mongol plan is not merely disrupted, it is inverted. Where they expected to be the scalpel, they are the patient. For decades, terror has been one of the Mongols' sharpest tools. Cities surrender rather than face the fate of those who resisted. Armies break at the rumor of a Khan's approach. The horde rides with an invisible aura. Resistance is not just futile, it is suicidal. On this field, that aura flickers. Men who are used to projecting fear are experiencing it in a form they cannot easily process. They have felt fear before, of course. There is always that moment in battle where the gap between life and death seems razor thin. But that fear has always been tied to something tangible. The enemy in front of you, the arrow in flight, the fortress wall. Thunder tubes attack that comfort. They introduce a threat that is felt before it is properly seen. You don't get to see the projectile and make a choice. You don't get to outshoot or outmaneuver it in the moment. By the time your senses register the blast, the killing is already done. Courage and training can't fully compensate because they have nothing familiar to hook into. There is no script that says, when the sky cracks at ground level and your horse wants to run, here is what a brave man does. The deeper humiliation is psychological. Mongol warriors have built their identities on a kind of pact. If they are skilled, disciplined, and coordinated, they can ride through anything. Their victories across continents seem to confirm that. When they do die, it feels within the rules of the world they understand. Now, something breaks those rules. They see comrades, ahead of them, beside them, crushed by forces that leave no visible agent. They feel their own mounts, partners in countless fights, disobeying under a kind of panic the riders cannot fully override. They taste helplessness in a way they have rarely known. That helplessness doesn't instantly transform an army into cowards, but it plants a new kind of doubt. Next time a commander orders a charge against an Indian line bristling with strange tubes, some part of each rider's mind will remember this day. Horses with their own memories of blast and smoke will pick up that hesitation in their riders' hands and knees. For an army whose strength lies in seamless confidence, man in himself, man in horse, unit in system, that half-second of internal friction matters. The Empire will not acknowledge this crack in its chronicles. But in the unrecorded spaces, nightmares, prayers, the way men flinch at sudden noises, it is already there. Terror has, at last, found its way home. Step back from the carnage and look at the mechanics. A thunder tube does three things at once. It throws a projectile, emits a violent pressure wave, and creates a thick cloud of irritating smoke. All three hit human and animal nervous systems like a coordinated ambush. The blast sound is sharp and sudden. It doesn't roll in like thunder, it punches. When such a sound erupts unexpectedly, the brain's alarm center, the amygdala, fires before higher reasoning kicks in. Adrenaline surges, heart rate spikes, fine motor control degrades. For a foot soldier, that might mean fumbling a bow or shield for a moment. For a mounted archer, it's more catastrophic. Balance wavers, timing is lost, the delicate dance of aim-release ride is shattered. Horses experience this even more intensely. Their survival has always depended on reacting instantly to potential threats. Loud, novel noises and strange smells are exactly the kind of input evolution has taught them to flee. A blast shocks their ears and vibrates their skulls. Smoke with a sulfurous tang claws at nostrils that are used to dust and sweat, not nitrates and char. Even if no shot hits them, their run circuitry fires. In a cavalry formation, that panic is contagious. One horse rears, the next shies. Reins tangle, riders yank and shout. The whole front becomes unstable. Even disciplined riders can't fully override a spooked animal in a split second. Indian commanders may not have known the words amygdala or sympathetic nervous system, but they observed the patterns. They saw that blast and smoke did psychological work beyond their raw physical damage. They saw that firing at the right time, not too early, not too late, maximized that effect. They noticed that multiple explosions together overwhelmed attention more than isolated bangs. In modern terms, they were running experiments on panic. Thunder tubes weren't just artillery, they were crude tools of cognitive warfare, designed to destabilize an enemy at the level of perception and reflex. That is why, when Mongol riders talk afterward about the battle, their language is full of sound and bewilderment, not just of wounds. They describe the noise, the way their horses lost their minds, the sense that something fundamental in the world had been violated. On that plain, the Indians weren't just throwing iron. They were, however, unconsciously, weaponizing the architecture of fear. Given all this, a fair question arises. The Mongols were famously adaptable. Why didn't they just copy the thunder tubes? In some theaters, they did experiment with gunpowder devices they encountered. They used Chinese engineers and siege weapons. They learned to handle rockets and rudimentary cannon in certain contexts. But adopting a tool isn't just about acquiring a recipe or a blueprint. It's about fitting that tool into your entire way of war. The Mongol system was optimized for lightness and speed. Armies moved with herds, not wagon trains. Their striking power came from mounted archers who could maneuver independently with minimal baggage. Their logistics and command structure were tuned to fluid, fast operations. Thunder tubes, as Delhi used them, pulled in the opposite direction. They required heavy metal, careful powder maintenance, specialized training, and often some form of prepared position. They worked best anchored to earthworks or fort walls, with infantry and perhaps lighter cavalry protecting them. Powder had to be kept dry and safe. Barrels had to be cast or forged in established workshops, then transported. For the Mongols to truly integrate such weapons, they would have had to alter their logistics, accept slower movement, and carve out a new specialist class. They would have had to fight more like the sedentary enemies they had always outclassed. Culturally, that was a hard sell. Their identity was built on the elegance of bow and horse, on the superiority of the steppe style over the clumsy warfare of settled peoples. To load up on heavy guns and wagons would have felt not just inconvenient, but dishonorable, a betrayal of what made them Mongol. Some commanders may have seen the potential, but empires are not infinitely flexible. They have inertia. They are shaped by what has worked so well for so long that alternatives feel almost unthinkable. Delhi, by contrast, was already a semi-sedentary, fortress-holding, workshop-rich state. It could more easily absorb heavy, temperamental weapons into its existing defensive architecture. Its survival depended on holding ground, not raiding across continents. The thunder tube thus reveals the limits of Mongol adaptability. They could incorporate foreign siege engines into their arsenal when it suited their style. But here, adapting fully would have meant becoming less Mongol, slower, more tied to fixed positions. Faced with that choice, they preferred to treat Indian thunder as a local annoyance, to be worked around rather than fundamentally answered. On that ridge and in battles like it, that decision wrote itself in dust and blood. Delhi's gamble on a new way of fighting had paid off just enough. The Mongols' refusal to rewire their own system meant they would never quite own this kind of thunder. They rode away from India with their core empire intact, but with a new boundary drawn. Not just on the map, but in what their way of war could realistically conquer. Yet if that moment on the plain was so world-bending, why do we not all grow up with it burned into our history books? How does an empire's first true humiliation simply vanish? To answer that, we have to leave the battlefield and step into the quieter war, the one fought in ink. The Mongols were not just masters of archery and logistics. They were masters of narrative. Their court historians wrote under the gaze of Khans whose legitimacy rested on an image of unstoppable victory. Chronicles like the secret history of the Mongols were crafted to turn campaigns into epics, defeats into strategic withdrawals, stalemates into footnotes. On the margins of these texts, you find hints, brief mentions of heavy losses in the lands of Hind, a campaign abandoned due to unfavorable conditions, vague references to thunder and strange engines on the walls of Indian cities. But never the full admission. We rode in as gods of war and came back as men who had met something worse than us. You do not carve your own humiliation into stone. On the Indian side, the record is no less distorted, but for different reasons. The Delhi Sultanate that survived the Mongol storm did not last forever. Dynasties turned over. Palaces fell to rival sultans, then to Central Asian conquerors, then to Mughals. Each new regime brought its own historians, its own priorities, its own desire to claim that history began with them. In the chaos of these transitions, libraries burned. Court chronicles were selectively copied. What survived was often what was useful to the next ruler's propaganda, not what mattered most to distant posterity. A dry reference to Naya Asla, new weapons, does not sing as loudly as a poem about an emperor's glory. And then came a later violence, colonial neglect. By the time European scholars began cataloging India's past in the 18th and 19th centuries, their eyes were tuned to different stories. They were fascinated by Sanskrit epics, by Buddhist stupas, by Mughal miniatures. They were looking for classical civilizations that matched their own categories, and for a prehistory that could be framed as waiting for European science. A half-corroded iron tube in a rural fort, labeled in a Persian hand as a roaring instrument, did not look like the beginning of anything. To many early catalogers, such artifacts were quaint curios, not the hardware of a technological revolution that had once terrified the greatest cavalry empire on earth. So the evidence scattered. Some of it lay under fields in Punjab, where farmers plowed through rusted fragments without a second thought. Some of it sat on the back shelves of museums, misidentified as ceremonial horns or mortars for grinding grain. Some of it slept in manuscripts, lines in Persian or Sanskrit or early vernaculars noting that fire tubes were deployed at a siege, or that iron thunder answered a Mongol assault. Each by itself was a whisper. None alone could reconstruct the scream. Meanwhile, the story of gunpowder warfare took on a different shape in global imagination. When later empires strode onto the stage with towering bombards and sleek matchlock muskets, they seized the spotlight. The Mughals thundering at the gates of Chittor, the Ottomans leveling Constantinople, European ships vomiting broadsides. That is where most textbooks begin their tale of firearms. Who remembers the awkward, dangerous prototypes when the polished descendants command such awe? It's the same bias that leads us to celebrate the smartphone and forget the clunky, failure-prone experiments of early computing. Successors eclipse pioneers. Clean stories overwrite messy origins. But history has a way of leaking back through its own seals. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a different kind of army began to assemble. Archaeologists with portable X-ray machines, metallurgists with electron microscopes, historians willing to read not just imperial chronicles, but also tax ledgers, siege manuals, and local ballads. They started noticing patterns. Why do certain 13th and 14th century North Indian forts have curious, oversized embrasures, holes in the walls angled not for archers, but for something heavier? Why do some battle descriptions suddenly include metaphors of mountains speaking or wrathful thunder, where previously only arrows and swords had spoken? Why do Mongol sources go oddly vague about particular Indian campaigns that by all logistical accounts should have ended in another easy sack? Piece by piece, the puzzle began to reassemble. A fragment of iron here, a line of poetry there, a scorch pattern on ancient masonry, a forgotten passage in a Persian historian describing tubes of fire that belched iron balls. None of them, alone, could overturn the standard narrative. Together, they trace the outline of something startling. A homegrown Indian tradition of gunpowder weapons emerging just as the Mongols battered at the gates. A tradition that did not vanish. It evolved into the artillery of later sultanates and empires, but whose first, raw, decisive use against the steppe riders was blurred first by pride, then by amnesia. And that is why you never heard this story in school. Not because it did not happen, but because history, like a battlefield in smoke, has blind spots. What we call the record is just what survived of what someone once chose to write, about what they chose to see. Moonlight Science walks into those blind spots with a torch. As we follow the trail of this forgotten thunder through rust, ash, and ink, we're not just resurrecting a clever weapon. We're revealing how fragile our picture of the past really is, and how much power lies in what gets written down and what gets left in the dark. So the story we're telling doesn't just live in chronicles and legends. It also lives in metal. Imagine walking into the back rooms of a regional museum in North India. Not the polished galleries with gleaming swords and jewel-inlaid armor, but the concrete corridors behind them, lined with shelves of unlabeled, half-forgotten things. Here, under a film of dust, are the echoes of that day when thunder met the horde. At first glance, they're underwhelming. Short, thick iron tubes, their surfaces pitted and flaking with orange rust. Strange bronze cylinders with blocked mouths and no obvious ornament. Broken chunks of metal that might just as easily be old plumbing as relics of war. For decades, that's exactly how many curators treated them. But to the right eyes, each one is a question. Pick up one of these tubes. Carefully, because centuries of corrosion make them fragile. You can feel, even through gloves, that the walls are thick, far thicker than a simple pipe would need to be. Peer into the bore. It's narrow, dark, maybe slightly flared at the mouth. At the sealed end, you might see a tiny drilled hole where a fuse could once have been touched. Already a story is whispering. Modern scientists don't stop at eyeballing. They wheel these artifacts under lights and lenses. Portable X-ray fluorescence scanners bathe them in invisible beams, reading their elemental makeup. Are we dealing with cast bronze, full of tin and traces of lead? or wrought iron, layered and fibrous, hammered into shape. Metallurgists slice microscopic samples from damaged sections, polish them, etch them with acid, and slide them under microscopes. On their computer screens, the grain of the metal tells a tale. In a cast bronze cannon, they see cooling dendrites, tree-like patterns frozen as the molten alloy solidified. In a forged iron tube, they see slag inclusions, hammer weld lines, the ghostly record of repeated heating and beating. Carbon content matters too. Too much, and the metal becomes brittle, more likely to shatter under pressure. Too little, and it's too soft, bulging with each shot. Indian smiths in the medieval period already knew how to make exquisite high-carbon steel for blades. Here, the readings show something different. A leaner mix, optimized for toughness rather than edge. Perfect for a barrel that must survive its own internal explosion. Then there are the burn patterns. Run your fingers along the inside, again carefully, and you find regions of unusual smoothness, where hot gases have scoured away roughness. Sometimes there are faint spiral striations, where the projectile, stone or iron, scraped as it hurtled out. Near the touch hole, the metal might be thinned or cracked, overstressed by repeated ignition. On the outer surface around that vent, dark discoloration seeps into the microstructure, the fingerprint of countless blasts. Measure the bore diameter, the length of the barrel, the thickness of the walls. Feed these numbers into modern equations of internal ballistics. How much black powder, at what composition? Could this tube realistically hold without bursting? What peak pressures would that generate? From that, you can estimate the muzzle velocity of a ball, its probable effective range, the likelihood that it could punch through leather armor, lamellar plates, even a horse's chest. Again and again, the calculations return a sobering truth. Even these early, crude devices had teeth. Some of the smaller pieces, barely longer than a man's forearm, would have been terrifying handguns. Primitive firearms you cradled or rested on a forked stick. Their range might have been limited to 100 meters or so. But at close quarters they could spit a hail of iron or lead that no shield wall or charging horse would easily shrug off. Larger fragments, from stout bronze bombards, tell of a different role. With bores wide enough to swallow a fist, they were perfect for hurling stone balls or grape shot into dense formations. Their dimensions, when compared with early European guns from the 14th century, are startlingly similar. In some cases, Indian examples are earlier. That's when the timeline starts to warp. For a long time, the standard story ran in a neat line. Gunpowder discovered in China, weapons developed there, then travel west, finally maturing in Europe, which perfects cannon and firearms and brings them back to India in the Age of Empire. But these tubes, pulled from North Indian soil and dated by associated pottery, coins, and radiocarbon samples from their archaeological layers, refuse to sit quietly in that script. Many of them cluster in the 13th and early 14th centuries, exactly when Mongol pressure on the Delhi frontier peaked. Combine that with the architectural evidence. Fort walls in this region dating to the same period with heavy, outward splayed embrasures, angled not for archers to lean from, but for squat guns to poke through. The geometry of the openings and the fields of fire they cover map almost perfectly onto the kill cones a cannon would create against a mass of horsemen approaching at speed. And then there are the texts. A Persian chronicler noting that iron mouths roared from the battlements and threw forth balls that crushed men and beasts alike. A local poem comparing the new weapons to wrathful gods who speak fire. A military manual that, in passing, instructs commanders to place Nara-astra, fire weapons, on the wings to disrupt cavalry. Individually, Each clue could be dismissed as metaphor, misdating, misinterpretation. Together, they cohere into something harder to ignore. A distinct, technically competent tradition of gunpowder weaponry in India that predates, and in some respects rivals, early European developments. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that tradition as a steppe cavalryman. Your entire tactical universe is built on judging bow range and charge distance with uncanny precision. You know how far an arrow will fly, how long your horse can sprint, how much time you have between sighting an enemy line and smashing into it. Suddenly, you are faced with a force whose deadliest range is not traced in visible arcs, but born in iron throats with no warning but a fuse and a hiss. The archaeological record, in its mute, rust-eaten way, confirms what the battlefield accounts suggested. This was not rumor. This was not exaggeration. On those plains and walls, Indian gunners wielded devices capable of projecting force in ways that rewrote the physics of fear. The iron is still here. It has outlived the horses, the khans, the sultans, and the chronicles. All it needed was for someone to listen. Once thunder had proved itself on the open plain, there was no putting it back in the box. Commanders who had watched Mongol cavalry dissolve under cannon fire began to imagine other uses. If a tube of iron could break a charge in the field, what might a row of them do from the safety of stone? So the weapon crept upward, onto walls. Picture a North Indian fort after those first victories. Its battlements are no longer lined only with archers and stone throwers. Between the crenellations now squat dark shapes, short, thick barrels peering out from carefully cut embrasures. The masons have adapted, carving wide, outward splayed mouths into the parapets. These aren't arrow slits, they're gun ports. Behind each opening sits a crew. They are learning a new choreography. One man tends the powder, keeping it dry in leather pouches. Another rams home the charge and wad. A third hefts the stone or iron ball, feeling its weight before sliding it down the bore. A fourth holds the slow match, its tip glowing like a fragment of captured sunset. Below, an enemy army grinds forward. Siege towers creak, ladders are raised, shields locked together. In earlier centuries, defenders would rain rocks and arrows, hoping sheer volume and gravity would do the work. Now, the captain walking the wall raises his hand and waits. Range matters more than ever. The trick is to let the attackers come just close enough that they fill the cannon's lethal cone, but not so close they can rush the parapet between shots. At his signal, the matches fall. The wall does not simply answer, it detonates. Tongues of fire leap from the embrasures, belching smoke and stone into the packed ranks. Siege towers shudder as balls slam into their frames, snapping beams, sending men tumbling. Ladders jerk sideways, their carriers thrown off their feet. In the churning confusion at the base of the wall, cannonballs ricochet, breaking legs and morale alike. The same principle that unraveled a cavalry charge now turns a steady assault into a stuttering, blood-slicked mess. Down at river level, the story is similar. India's great waterways had always been strategic highways, routes for trade, armies, and invaders. Whoever controlled the crossings controlled the land. Now, small boats glide out onto these currents bearing more than archers. A light cannon is bolted to the prow, its barrel lashed to a crude wooden swivel. Imagine a Mongol detachment trying to ford a river under cover of darkness. Halfway across, the gloom splits open. A flash, a roar, and an iron ball skips across the water's surface like a demon-thrown stone, smashing into men and horses waist-deep in the current. Panic amplifies as the next shot lands slightly upstream, then the next downstream. One gun, pivoting back and forth, suddenly controls the entire width of the river. To make all this possible, the hardware itself has to evolve. Early tubes, which might once have been fired by bracing them on the ground or wall edge, sprout wooden beds and crude wheels. Carriages are born. Craftsmen experiment with different ways to absorb or redirect recoil. Wedges behind the wheels, ropes to check backward slide, heavy beams to anchor the whole structure. Each miscalculation leaves telltale gouges in stone, splintered planks, bruised shoulders. Gunners learn the hard way that a cannon that cannot be quickly brought back on target after firing is half useless. So aiming mechanisms, at first no more than wedges and shims under the breech, later simple elevating screws, enter the picture. Vertical angle becomes something you can tune with a twist, not a guess. Gun founders, meanwhile, push in both directions. On one end of the spectrum, they refine small, portable pieces. Handheld fire tubes are trimmed, lightened, sometimes mounted on forked rests. Their bores are standardized enough that shot can be cast in batches. Infantry entrusted with these early firearms are drilled separately, forming specialized units that can lay down bursts of noise and metal where a commander points. On the other end, in deep pits and smoky foundries, monster bombards are born. These are not subtle weapons. Their barrels are wide enough that a child could curl up inside. They are built in sections, sometimes with iron staves bound by heated hoops, sometimes cast whole in bronze if the patron is rich and the foundry brave. Moving them from workshop to fortress is a campaign in itself, requiring teams of oxen, reinforced roads, days of careful hauling. But once in position before an enemy gate, they turn stone into something shockingly temporary. Wedge the muzzle on a bed of earth, pack an obscene amount of powder behind a perfectly fitted stone ball, and brace yourself. When the fuse burns down and the charge goes, the ground itself jumps. The ball hammers into masonry with a dull, sickening impact, showering defenders with shards. Do this again and again. Walls that would have laughed at arrows and endured rams for weeks suddenly sprout cracks after a handful of carefully placed shots. In all these incarnations, handgun, field piece, rampart gun, river swivel, siege bombard, one design principle repeats like a mantra: own the space between. Not just the strip of ground a spear can reach, or the graceful arc an arrow can describe, but the invisible, instantaneous path between muzzle and target. Time itself becomes compressed. The old dance of advance and response, of charge and countercharge, is squeezed into a fraction of a second. The time it takes a spark to leap, powder to flare, and a ball to cross open air. The Mongols had built their empire on controlling that in-between world with speed and skill. Now, Indian engineers and gunners were redrawing that space with blast and iron, whether on the plain, atop a wall, or over dark water. What began as a desperate experiment against the horde had become something broader. A new architecture of power, built wherever a barrel could be mounted and a match brought close. The more these weapons spread, from field to fortress to river, the more they began to warp something deeper than walls or armor. They warped the shape of battle itself. Before gunpowder, a commander's mental map of a battlefield was drawn in curves and circles. He thought in arcs of arrows, in the wheeling of cavalry, in the shrinking distance between two advancing lines. A good general could almost feel ranges in his bones. This far and an arrow will fall short, that far and lances will strike home, beyond that lies safety. The Iron Thunder tore that map up. Stand with an Indian commander on a slight rise above his army a few years after the first thunderous victories. The sun glares off spear points, shield bosses, and helmet crests. Once, he would have worried first about his wings, keeping cavalry strong on the flanks to prevent encirclement, watching for the telltale dust of an enemy detachment trying to get around him. Now his eyes linger on different things. The low silhouettes of cannons, the slight depressions and earthworks around them, the open ground in front of each barrel. In his mind, invisible wedges jut out from every muzzle. Kill cones. Within those cones, at certain ranges, anything that enters can be smashed in an instant if the gunners are ready. Between cones lie dead zones that must be covered by archers or infantry. Behind the guns, corridors must be kept clear so pieces can be wheeled back, reloaded, and brought forward again without tripping over their own side. His staff talks less about left and right and more about fields of fire. This new geometry of battle changes how he deploys everyone else. Infantry are no longer just a thick wall of men standing in the front rank for honor's sake. They become the shield and skeleton of the artillery position. Lines of spearmen and sword bearers are placed slightly forward and to the sides of the guns, ready to intercept any enemy who somehow survives the storm and tries to rush the crews. Their job is to hold the enemy inside the cones of fire for as long as possible. Archers, too, are repositioned. Rather than standing in one solid block, they're spread in arcs that complement the cannon's lethal wedges, filling in the gaps with shafts where shot cannot easily reach. Sometimes they're held back for a different purpose: to fire over the heads of friendly infantry at broken formations that the guns have already scattered. And cavalry, especially precious heavy horse, are no longer thrown forward early to meet their opposite numbers head-on. They're held back, resting and ready, like a fist waiting for exactly the right moment when the enemy's structure buckles under iron and sound. Watch now as an enemy, perhaps a Mongol vanguard, perhaps a local rival who has hired steppe mercenaries, approaches across open ground, like Sultanate the past. These riders would have gauged arrow range and played their deadly game at its outer edge. Riding in loose order, loosing shafts, wheeling away just beyond the point where enemy arrows could reach them in return. Their strength lay in that liminal zone. Close enough to hurt, far enough not to be hurt. But the cannons don't care about that zone. From the Indian hilltop, the commander sees the Mongols fan out into their familiar crescent. He notes the line where they begin to pepper his front ranks with arrows. In previous eras, this would have forced him into a grim choice: advance into the storm or endure it until morale frayed. Now he raises a different flag. Down along his front, fuses touch vents. The first volley is not aimed at the very front of the Mongol line, but slightly beyond where they expect danger to begin. Balls howl into the space they thought was safe, plowing through horses and men who, for once, are not braced for impact. The Mongols try to adjust, pulling back a little. Gunners, watching range markers, simple stakes or stones driven into the earth, adjust elevation and powder. A second volley reaches out like an iron hand, finding them again. The safety band narrows. Then it disappears altogether. Suddenly, the old calculus of distance and speed fails. Closer in, where a desperate charge might once have punched through slower infantry, the geometry is equally cruel. To close on a gun line, a unit must pass through one cone of fire after another, each one timed to catch them at maximum density and panic. There is no single front anymore. There are overlapping zones of instant death. This has a cascading effect on tactics. Flanking, once the golden objective, becomes riskier. To sweep around the side of an Indian army now means threading through unknown kill zones, any one of which might be hiding a swivel gun or light piece ready to scythe across your trajectory. Even reconnaissance grows more hazardous, scouts can blunder into a short-range blast before they have time to see, report, and alter course. Over time, Indian tacticians formalize these insights. Diagrams in military treatises, once devoted to blocky rectangles of infantry and curved arrows showing cavalry sweeps, start including straight, radiating lines from stylized cannons. Marginal notes talk about zones of annihilation, about the angle at which two guns should be sighted to cross their fire, so that no enemy can slip safely between. The Mongols, facing this alien mathematics, find their instincts betraying them. The distance at which an experienced rider used to feel invulnerable now becomes the distance at which his comrades begin to vanish in puffs of dust and blood. The shallow hollow he would once have used as cover becomes a trap if a gun is sighted along its length. The careful timing of charges, so many heartbeats from spotting to collision, no longer matches the new, compressed tempo created by instantaneous fire. For an empire whose genius lay in reading terrain and range like a second language, this rewriting of spatial logic is devastating. It's as if someone has taken the familiar step and folded it, added invisible cliffs and sinkholes where none existed before. Battle, once a moving dance around curved arcs of risk, has become a crueler board game, defined by invisible straight lines of destruction radiating from a few anchored points. And in that new geometry, the horse lords discover that speed and skill are no longer enough, because knowledge itself has become a weapon. If the new geometry of battle was drawn in iron, its equations were written in smoke. Out on the firing grounds, bare patches of earth outside forts, dried riverbeds, abandoned fields, groups of gunners and apprentices gathered around their temperamental beasts. They had no blackboards. Their chalk was soot on stone, their formulas the scars each shot left on the world. Watch them work. A gun is dragged into position, its barrel still warm from the last volley. One man tips a leather bag and pours powder into a measure, a hollowed-out gourd or a carved wooden scoop. Another rams the charge down the bore, followed by wadding and a stone ball. A third squints along the barrel, gauging angle by eye against a distant tree or rock. The first shot booms. Dust leaps where the ball slams into the ground, far short of the intended mark. The crew coughs, blinks through the drifting smoke, and takes in the result. No one writes down numbers, but everyone remembers. At this elevation, with this much powder, the ball landed here. They make a change. A wedge of wood is kicked under the breech, raising the muzzle a hair. Or perhaps they add a little more powder, tamping it down with a grunt. Another shot. Another plume of dust, this time closer. They talk quietly, argue in fragments. Too high. No, more charge. Wind is against us. Bit by bit, these conversations harden into rules. Do this, and that happens. An experienced gunner begins to accumulate a library in his head. He knows that in the damp months when the monsoon has just passed, powder burns slower, and charges must be bigger to throw the ball the same distance. He knows that when the air is thin and hot, the same scoop of powder will send a shot further. He notices that lighter stones fly erratically, buffeted by gusts, while heavier ones punch through wind but arc lower. None of this is framed as ballistics. It is simply survival. On the walls, the same process unfolds with different constraints. Here, the target is often closer. A siege tower, a cluster of sappers at the base of the wall. So the gunners must learn to depress their barrels just enough without slamming balls into their own masonry. They discover that firing too flat may cause the shot to bury itself harmlessly in the wall's glacis or the earthworks. Too steep, and it sails over attackers' heads, wasting powder. So a repertoire of good angles is born. Old gunners tap a particular notch on the carriage or mark a spot on the parapet stone. For men at the ditch, aim here, for towers here. What they are doing, in essence, is building a crude, experiential version of what centuries later will be drawn as parabolic curves in European artillery manuals. When you read those manuals, the 16th century European treatises, with their neat diagrams of cannon at different angles and shots tracing elegant arches, you hear faint echoes. At 45 degrees, the greatest range. At lesser angles, a flatter but shorter shot. Indian gunners had no such geometrical proofs, but through thousands of rounds, they stumbled on the same insights. There is an ideal marriage of angle and power for every target. They also learned about the treacherous friend called recoil. Early on, a blast might kick a gun back so violently that it jarred the aim of the next shot or even toppled the carriage. Gunners began to note that heavier carriages pushed the recoil into the ground at the cost of mobility, while lighter ones leapt like startled animals. Ropes to check backward slide, chocks behind wheels, and carefully dug pits behind the wheels became standard. Again, no equations, just tested practice. Even misfires and disasters taught lessons. A burst barrel, horrific for the crew, was also a data point. When foundrymen examined the twisted wreckage, they saw where the metal had thinned, where slag inclusions had weakened the structure. Over time, they increased wall thickness at vulnerable points, changed forging methods, or adjusted alloy ratios. The relation between powder strength, chamber size, and barrel integrity was being mapped with each catastrophic failure. Occasionally, a curious mind went further. In some surviving Indian texts, we catch glimpses of more abstract thinking. Verses compare the flight of a cannonball to that of an arrow with the weight of 10 arrows together, noting how it rises from the earth and then returns to it, obeying no hand. A manual might say, for every 2 parts of distance, increase the powder 3 parts, hinting at an intuitive grasp that the relationship between range and charge is not linear. Is this calculus? No. But it is pattern recognition, the beating heart of all science. Every time a crew lined up a shot, fired, watched, and adjusted, they were running an experiment. The battlefield was their laboratory. The cannon was their apparatus. The variables were powder mass, projectile mass, barrel elevation, and air. The outcome was brutal. Immediate feedback. Did it hit? Did it kill? Did it frighten? In Europe, centuries later, artillerists would formalize this observational tradition in printed range tables, meticulously recording how far a given gun threw a given shot at a given angle under ideal conditions. Indian gunners, operating without printing presses or standardized equipment, did the same work in a more oral, situational way. Their tables carried in memory and transmitted as apprenticeship lore. It's easy, looking backward from our age of differential equations and computer simulations, to dismiss these smoky rule of thumbs as primitive. But strip away the notation, and what's left is the same intellectual act. Change one thing, observe the result, adjust. In the hands of these anonymous men, burned and deafened by their own craft, physics wasn't a set of abstract laws. It was the difference between repelling a siege or seeing your city walls crumble, between scattering a Mongol charge or being ridden down under hooves. With every blast, they weren't just killing enemies. They were sketching, invisible in the air, the first rough graphs of trajectories and forces. Science written in fire rather than ink. Knowledge born in smoke and thunder, it does not stay where it's made. It travels, clinging to the clothes of soldiers, carried in the memories of merchants, woven into the gossip of caravanserais. The Mongol defeats in India were not grand, stage-managed spectacles. There was no single banner torn from a Khan's hand, no neat surrender ceremony. There were campaigns that faltered, raids that bled out, plans that unraveled under iron hail. But their effects leaked out anyway. Picture a caravan winding west from the Punjab toward Kabul and beyond. Bales of cloth creak on camelbacks, leather sacks of spices and saltpeter swing with each step. Among the travelers are men who have seen things they can't forget. Mongol riders wheeling away from Indian lines in confusion, proud banners turning in retreat. At night, under low mud brick roofs, lit by oil lamps, stories begin. A trader from Multan, pouring tea, says quietly, "They came again, yes, like before. But this time our Sultan had new thunder. The horses could not stand it. They broke." His listener, a cloth merchant from Bukhara, scoffs instinctively. "The horse lords? Break? You exaggerate." Yet he leans closer. Another voice joins in, a driver who once hauled fodder for a Mongol tumen. "My cousin rode with them. He came back with his arm in a sling and his eyes strange. He said the sky itself roared. No one could see what killed their front ranks. They say the Indians have captured demons. In the morning, they all laugh it off and haggle over prices. By the time each man reaches the next town, the tale has shifted slightly. But its core has hardened. The invincible ones were turned back. For people who have lived under Mongol tribute, that idea is a shock to the mental system. Remember, the Mongol Empire did not rule solely by metal and horseflesh. It ruled by myth. Cities surrendered at the rumor of their approach because the alternative, resisting and being annihilated, seemed certain. Chronicles from Persia, Rus, and China all echo the same tone: inevitability. Facing the Khan was like facing winter. You did not win. You survived or you didn't. Now comes this quiet, contagious counter-narrative. They are not inevitable. In far-off Damascus, a scholar hears from a traveler that, in Hind, the Tatars found their match. He tucks the phrase into a sermon, half as a moral about hubris. In a Georgian village, an old soldier who once fought and lost against the Mongols listens to a peddler describe Indian roaring mouths of iron and feels for the first time in years something like revenge by proxy. The Mongols themselves are not immune to this erosion of aura. Within their own camps, among the yurts and cook fires, there are words you are not supposed to say. Defeat is an expensive one. Still, men talk. A young warrior hears his uncle speak in low tones about the cursed land of Hind, where horses rear at sounds and men fall without arrows in them. He laughs it off, outwardly. But a crack has appeared in his picture of the world. The Khans sense this danger, even if they do not name it. An empire built on awe cannot afford visible embarrassment. So the chroniclers downplay these Indian campaigns, or frame them as minor probes abandoned for strategic reasons. The rhetoric remains one of dominance. Yet the Khan's strategic choices begin to betray a new caution. Why pour resources again and again into a theater where the returns are uncertain and the risks to reputation high? You can see this calculus in where the Mongol machine turns next. To the richer, more normal battlefields of the Middle East and China, where the rules of war still favor horse archers and psychological shock. Meanwhile, in the mental landscape of those they subjugate, a small but potent seed has been planted. If India, battered again and again, could stop them with the right tools, then perhaps others could too. Maybe sheer courage, or numbers, or divine favor were not the only answers. Maybe what mattered was a willingness to change the rules, to think sideways, to invent, to use the world's hidden properties as force multipliers. It is hard to prove a direct line from these whispered tales to later acts of resistance elsewhere. History rarely offers such clean connections. But we know this. The Mongol aura of unstoppable expansion did not last forever. As soon as any empire's myth of inevitability cracks, alternatives begin to glow in the imagination. On some level, the humiliation of the Mongol war machine in India was a localized event. No great capital fell because of it. No borders leapt dramatically on maps. Yet, in another sense, it was part of a quiet global shift. From a world where brute, inherited modes of fighting seemed unchallengeable, to a world where knowledge itself, applied ruthlessly, could humble the mightiest riders on earth. The Indian cannons didn't just blow holes in Mongol formations. They blew holes in the story the Mongols told about themselves, and in the stories others believed about them. In the long run, that narrative shrapnel may have traveled farther and cut deeper than any single iron ball. The cracks in the Mongol myth spread like hairline fractures through glass, and through those fractures, something far larger moved. The age of gunpowder. If we pull the camera back now, away from the specific plains and forts of North India, the flashes of iron thunder we've been following become part of a much broader constellation of fire. Centuries turn. In the mid-15th century, far to the west, the walls of Constantinople rise above the Bosporus as they have for 1,000 years, triple-layered and smug in their impregnability. Armies have battered themselves to pieces on these stones and broken like waves. Then the Ottomans arrive with something new. Massive bombards, cast from tons of bronze, dragged by oxen and men for weeks. When those monsters speak, the city's ancient defenses crack and sag. Chroniclers describe the sound as the earth groaning. Stones that have watched empires come and go explode outward in clouds of dust and masonry. After 53 days of bombardment, a city that once defined impenetrable lies open. Behind the smoke, the core principle is the same one Indian gunners worked out against the Mongols. No matter how thick your wall or how fast your horse, controlled explosion can reach you. On European coasts, wooden ships once fought by ramming or by boarding, their sides little more than planks. Then ports in Venice, Lisbon, London, and Amsterdam begin to produce vessels with something more sinister. Rows of iron tubes peering from rectangular holes, mouths black and patient. When these ships close, they don't just scrape and shout, they erupt. Broadsides transform naval combat. Instead of a handful of men with crossbows on a castle-like foredeck, an entire flank becomes a continuous firing platform. A timed volley from a line of guns can turn the side of an enemy ship into splinters and screams in seconds. Again, we see the same choice that confronted Indian commanders. Own the in-between space with instantaneous chemical force rather than trust to muscle, wind, and courage alone. On steppe frontiers in Eastern Europe, cavalry once reigned like their Mongol predecessors. Then come smaller, handheld children of those early thunder tubes, matchlocks, arquebuses, muskets. At first they're temperamental and slow, distrusted by old-school knights who prefer the feel of lance and sword. But in battle after battle, lines of men with fire sticks standing in disciplined ranks tear gaping holes in charging horsemen who never quite reach them in one piece. Behind all these mutations, gunpowder flows like an underground river, recipes learned, tweaked, and jealously guarded. Saltpeter plantations and mines, sulfur caravans and charcoal burners working in forests and villages. Every culture that adopts the black powder trinity bends it to its own ends, wraps it in its own myths. China, where the story of gunpowder likely began in earnest, refines rockets and multi-stage fire arrows. The Middle East develops complex siege artillery and handguns. Europe layers mechanical innovation, locks, rifling, recoil systems, on top of the chemical base. India itself, beyond those early fortresses we visited, becomes home to mighty Mughal guns. Colossal pieces like the Jaivana cannon at Jaipur, or intricately cast swivel guns on riverboats and war elephants. The family resemblance between all these devices is uncanny once you know what to look for. A tough, enclosed chamber, a rapidly expanding gas, a projectile being forced down a constrained path by that gas. A designer somewhere, centuries before computer models, quietly calculating, how much pressure can this tube stand before it fails? How heavy a shot can we throw how far? The Indian anti-Mongol weapons were not the first in some absolute sense. Other geniuses elsewhere were playing with fire for their own reasons. But those tubes on the plains of North India were among the earliest confirmed instances where this principle, an explosion harnessed not for spectacle or mining, but for systematically breaking a sophisticated mobile army, was tested and proven in open warfare. They were a node in a growing, interconnected network of knowledge. Ideas rarely travel as blueprints. They travel as rumors of effects. They have thunder that breaks horses. Their walls speak with fire. A visiting envoy sees a cannon on a wall and doesn't get the exact powder ratio, but he notices the vent, the carriage, the way crews work. A captured gun is taken home, studied, copied badly at first, then improved. The information loops back, altered, like a gene passed through many generations. Over centuries, that looping exchange of trick, tweak, and terror produces the gunpowder world we recognize. Bastioned fortresses designed specifically to mount cannons. Infantry drilled to fire in volleys, reload in ranks, and advance under covering fire. Artillery parks at the hearts of field armies, their positions dictating strategy. Cities measured not just by their walls, but by the reach of the guns on those walls. From there, the line continues. Darker. Rifles miniaturize the tube, increase precision, extend range. Shells replace solid shot with timed explosions. Machine guns accelerate the cycle. From bang, reload, bang to streams of bullets, each little death riding its own micro-explosion. Aircraft carry flying versions of cannon. Naval guns grow to the point where a single shell weighs as much as an early Indian bombard's entire barrel. Eventually, we arrive at artillery that can arc shells over horizons and rockets that leave the atmosphere. And then, in the 20th century, someone asks a terrible question. If a small controlled explosion can throw a lump of iron across a field, what can a chain reaction do? The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki are, in the most abstract sense, descendants of those first black powder blasts on the Indian frontier. The scale and physics differ, but the underlying decision is familiar. Use the hidden energies in matter itself to do what flesh and sinew cannot. Overwhelm mobility, courage, and skill with force drawn from deeper wells of nature. It all circles back to that choice made by some forgotten Indian artisan, some besieged commander, to make fire travel in a tube, to turn a momentary chemical violence into a repeatable, aimed phenomenon. The weapon that humiliated the Mongols did not disappear as a curious footnote. Its logic spread like a shadow cast forward in time. Whenever you see a modern gun, a rocket, a missile, you are seeing the long shadow of that decision. To seize the terrifying, beautiful, indifferent power of an explosion and bend it, however imperfectly, to human will. If we trace the long shadow of gunpowder across continents, another, more human pattern starts to emerge in that darkness. It's not just curiosity or greed that pushes societies to rethink how they fight. It's something far more painful. Humiliation. Go back to Delhi before the first fire tubes barked at Mongol horsemen. The court had already tasted that humiliation more than once. Punjabi fields burned. Border forts were trampled. Stories came in of villages erased, of columns of smoke marking where the horde had passed. On some days, riders reached almost to the capital's outskirts, their banners visible from the walls before they wheeled away, unpunished. For a ruling elite that saw itself as the shield of the subcontinent, this was more than a military problem. It was an existential insult. In audience halls thick with incense and argument, the old solutions were laid on the table again and again. More cavalry, better armor, stronger walls, but each proposal carried the bitter memory of having already failed. The Mongols had outrun, outshot, or simply bypassed those defenses. The humiliation was cumulative. It pressed on the chests of sultans and generals like a physical weight. It is under that kind of pressure that minds begin to crack or to bend. Someone in that ecosystem, some combination of alchemist, metallurgist, and warlord, was willing to entertain an idea that, a generation earlier, might have sounded sacrilegious or foolish. Abandon the fantasy of matching the Mongols at their own game. Stop trying to outride the horse lords. Instead, invite something untamed into the arsenal, a volatile powder, a dangerous tube, and gamble that the risk of self-destruction was worth the chance to derail the enemy's script. That's the first half of the pattern. Humiliation as a catalyst for innovation. The other half is more tragic. Humiliation ignored. The Mongols felt their own version of shame in India. It was subtler, filtered through chroniclers and commanders. Campaigns that were supposed to be routine raids bogged down. Losses mounted in ways that didn't fit past experience. Horses panicked at sounds and flashes no one could shoot back at. Veteran officers, who prided themselves on calm under arrow storms, found their nerves fraying when the ground itself seemed to burst. This was a moment when the empire could have pivoted. They had the raw materials, sharp minds, a tradition of adaptability, access to craftsmen from conquered lands who understood metal and fire. They could have asked, "What is this thunder? How can we make it ours? How must our logistics, our tactics, even our sense of what it means to be a Mongol warrior change to accommodate it?" But identity is a powerful break. To embrace cannon and fire tubes would have been to admit that the bow and the horse were no longer supreme. It would have meant slowing down, hauling iron and powder, training specialists who fought on foot, accepting that some power now lay in static objects, not in the fluid movement of the horde. It would have required swallowing a kind of cultural pride that said, "We are the ultimate cavalry. Our way is the pinnacle." Instead, the Mongol system largely chose to sidestep, redirect, and eventually fragment its earlier humiliations folded away under other concerns. History repeats this double lesson with grim regularity. In 1914, European generals marched millions of men toward machine guns, still drunk on 19th century dreams of cavalry charges and bayonet glory. Within weeks, reality shredded those illusions. Trenches, barbed wire, and belts of bullets turned open fields into charnel houses. The armies that survived were the ones that internalized the humiliation fastest, that rethought artillery, infantry tactics, and logistics under fire. Those who clung longest to old doctrines paid in blood. In 1941 and 1942, proud battleships, symbols of national prestige, were sent to sea believing their heavy armor and guns made them queen of the oceans. Then aircraft, carrying small packages of high explosive, humiliated them in hours. At Pearl Harbor, at Taranto, off the coast of Malaya. Ships that had taken years and fortunes to build were gutted from above by machines that cost a fraction as much and relied on a new geometry of risk. Three-dimensional, airborne, indifferent to armor thickness. Navies that learned quickly reoriented around carriers and air power. Those that did not saw their steel empires rust beneath foreign skies. Again and again, the same pattern. A proud system meets an innovation it did not invent. Initial encounters are brushed off as aberrations, bad luck, or the fault of individual commanders. If the humiliation is deep enough and repeated enough, someone is forced to ask, is it us? Is it our assumptions? Those are the moments when revolutions in military science happen. India's response to Mongol pressure was not inevitable. It came from a specific psychological crucible, being repeatedly threatened with annihilation by an enemy who played a different game, and being just self-aware enough to change. The horror of seeing steppe banners near Delhi's horizon wasn't just a trauma. It was information, brutally delivered. The Mongols' response, or lack of it, was also not fixed. They were capable of genius adaptation elsewhere, turning Chinese siegecraft into their own, for example. But in this theater, against this weapon, they hesitated, and that hesitation marked the beginning of their limits. The larger pattern that Moonlight Science wants you to see is uncomfortable because it points a finger forward in time at us. When we watch drone footage today of tanks burned out by cheap flying bombs or warships harassed by swarms of low-cost missiles, we are watching another version of horse lords meeting thunder. Somewhere, in some defense ministry, proud doctrines are being quietly humiliated. Somewhere, a decision is being made. Change, or pretend this was a fluke. The story of that Indian weapon and the Mongol Empire is not just a curious episode. It's an early chapter in a recurring saga, how human societies learn under pressure, and how often they wait until their pride is on fire before they admit the world has changed. If humiliation reshapes tactics, it does something even stranger to the stories people tell about why anyone wins or loses in the first place. For centuries before thunder tubes, many cultures shared a comfortable assumption. The battlefield was a kind of moral arena. Yes, numbers and training mattered, but so did less tangible things: valor, divine favor, the purity of a ruler's lineage. Warriors believed that courage and righteousness, properly aligned, could tilt the odds. Priests and poets reinforced this, casting victory as a visible sign of unseen approval. Now imagine standing on a field where a nobody with a smoky iron tube has just killed a man whose reputation could fill an epic. The distance between their personal qualities is vast. One is perhaps a pressed peasant or low-ranking infantryman, trembling as he touches match to vent. The other is a veteran horse lord, or a mailed Rajput knight, or a Turkic noble, the sort of figure whose prowess used to decide battles in hand-to-hand duels. The ball does not care. When it strikes, it erases the hierarchy between them as ruthlessly as it erases flesh. The anonymous gunner survives. The legend crumples. For onlookers steeped in older worldviews, this is not just a tactical shock, it's a theological one. In Delhi and other Indian courts, this unease begins to seep into writings and debates. Some chroniclers laud the new fire mouths as clear signs that God, or the gods, depending on who is speaking, has granted this knowledge to the faithful as a shield against invaders. Just as divine beings once armed heroes with celestial weapons in epics, they argue, so too might the Almighty now arm a beleaguered sultanate with thunder. Others are not so sure. Sufi mystics, ascetic yogis, and temple scholars look at the transformation of war with a more jaundiced eye. They note that a coward can now kill the brave from afar, that a ruler can win without ever risking his own body. Where, they ask, is the trial of the soul in that? If virtue and courage no longer strongly correlate with survival on the battlefield, can we still read moral lessons from who wins? In some texts, you can feel the anxiety peeking through. A commentator on a Persian chronicle might caution that reliance on engines of fire should not replace reliance on God. A Sanskrit poet describing a siege might stress that the defenders, though using roaring tubes, still relied ultimately on their dharma, their righteous duty, to see them through. It's as if everyone is trying to stitch the new, ugly fabric of explosive reality onto an older moral tapestry without tearing it. Debates about the permissibility of such weapons begin to shade into questions we recognize instantly today. Is it honorable to kill without risking yourself? Some argue yes, if the cause is just and the enemy ruthless. After all, if the Mongols show no mercy, why should one handicap oneself for the sake of chivalry? Others worry that this logic has no natural stopping point. If victory alone justifies any means, what then limits cruelty or prevents the erosion of all codes of war? Religions that have rules for combat, Islam's injunctions about non-combatants and cruelty, Hindu concepts of kshatriya dharma, the warrior's duty, suddenly have to deal with situations those rules never explicitly imagined. Is firing a cannon into a packed group of enemies acceptable if you know it may also kill camp followers or beasts? Are siege bombards that collapse walls onto defenders and civilians alike fundamentally different in moral weight from a battering ram? These were not purely abstract puzzles. Judges, qadis, and pandits had to answer real petitions. Could a ruler levy special taxes to build and maintain these engines? Could artisans who made them be barred from temples or mosques as impure, or should they be honored as defenders of the realm? When a misfire killed friendly soldiers, was it martyrdom, accident, or punishment for misplaced reliance on man-made thunder? Some thinkers reached for an old solution to a new problem: intention. If the intention behind the use of a fire weapon was righteous, defense of the innocent, preservation of order, then its horror might be tolerable, even sanctified. If used for wanton conquest or cruelty, then even the most advanced device became an instrument of sin. This way, the old axis of morality could be preserved, not in the mechanics of killing, but in the heart directing the mechanism. Still, unease lingered. Artists began to paint battles differently, with more smoke and distance, fewer heroic close-ups. Folk tales shifted from single champions dominating a field to trickster figures outwitting stronger foes with cunning devices. In the religious imagination, the battlefield was no longer just a proving ground for individual souls. It was becoming a proving ground for ideas and tools. Fast forward to our own age, and the parallels come into painful focus. Today, ethicists debate whether it is right to fire missiles from drones piloted thousands of kilometers away, or to let algorithms decide when to pull the trigger. Military chaplains and philosophers ask whether nuclear deterrence, threatening almost unimaginable destruction to prevent war, is compatible with any humane doctrine. Strip away the acronyms and satellites, and you can hear the same questions echoing from those Indian plains. Does a weapon that separates personal risk from lethal effect corrupt courage or refine strategy? Are we meant, morally, to face our enemies eye to eye? Or is it acceptable, even praiseworthy, to use distance and technology to save our own while killing theirs? When fire leaves the hearth and enters the barrel, does it remain just another tool? Or does it drag our ethics into a new, unstable orbit. When Indian gunners first lit fuses against Mongol cavalry, they were not just launching projectiles. They were launching a series of philosophical tremors that have not stopped rippling. Every time we flinch at the thought of a faceless operator sending death by keystroke, every time we argue about clean wars fought with precision weapons, we are still wrestling with that first moment when an ordinary man behind a tube of iron could make thunder the final court of appeal. For a while now, we've stood with kings and engineers, with philosophers and chroniclers. But weapons are not wielded by abstractions. They're handled by hands, calloused, burned, trembling. Come closer, to the edge of a firing position on some forgotten North Indian field. A cannon squats in the dust, its barrel blackened, its carriage scarred. Around it, a crew moves in a tight, practiced circle. One man, bare-armed despite the risk, measures powder with a gourd that was once used to scoop water. Another fumbles with the wad, twisted cloth, dry grass, anything to seal the charge. A third lifts the stone ball with a grunt, guiding it into the dark throat. Their clothes stink of sulfur and sweat. Their ears ring constantly. There is no such thing as hearing protection. The only way to save your senses is to be far from the work. And work for them means standing literally over controlled explosions again and again. They joke as they load, because joking holds fear at bay. They all know someone who no longer jokes, a nephew whose face is a ruin from a premature blast, a friend who leaned too close to the vent and lost an eye to sparks, a quiet man who dropped a bag of powder near a bivouac, stray ember, and vanished in a sudden, absolute whiteness no one could even look at, leaving only a slick on the ground. Every misfire, every burst barrel, is not just a failure of equipment. It is a body, or several, torn apart by the same power they have been asked to harness for the safety of others. There is a moment before each shot when time thins. The crew has stepped back. The slow match smolders in a gunner's hand, its end glowing like a small, patient demon. He closes his eyes for an instant. Perhaps he murmurs a prayer. Then he leans in, touches ember to vent, and flinches as the world detonates. The blast doesn't fade when the smoke drifts. It travels invisibly in the air and in men. Across the field, Mongol riders feel it as a blow that passes through leather and bone, straight into the primitive parts of brain and gut. Some die instantly. A ball slams into a chest and exits in a shower of meat, or hits a horse mid-leap, tearing legs from body. Others are wounded in slower ways. A thigh mangled, a jaw shattered, an arm hanging by skin. They look down, disbelieving, at wounds with no visible weapon in them. There is no arrow to pull, no spear to snap, just holes where life was a moment ago. The horses pay too. Their bodies pile in bizarre, tangled heaps, necks twisted, eyes wide in frozen panic, hooves still spasmed in a last kick. For creatures bred to run, to flee danger, to trust their riders, this sudden, incomprehensible violence is the worst betrayal. They die screaming, and that sound burrows into the memories of anyone within earshot. We tend to talk about the humiliation of the Mongol Empire as if an abstraction was embarrassed. But humiliation on the ground felt like this. A proud cavalryman stumbling away without his mount, guts seeping, having never gotten close enough to strike. A seasoned commander watching his formation collapse into chaos, powerless to impose order under the drumbeat of explosions. On the other side, in the Indian lines, victory also has a cost. Gunners go deaf in their 30s, their world reduced to muffled murmurs and constant ringing. Their shoulders are permanently bruised from ramming charges, their lungs scarred by years of breathing in fine charcoal dust. They carry burns on their arms, powder scars in their beards, and an intimate knowledge that a single mistake can turn them from weapon wielder into a red smear. Infantry standing near the guns are concussed again and again, their nights full of phantom bangs and flashes. Many will flinch at sudden noises for the rest of their lives. Some develop what we would now call trauma. Nightmares of smoke and torn bodies, of horses trying to stand on broken legs, of faces they cannot forget. And after the noise stops, there is the counting. When the air clears over a battlefield where fire tubes have spoken, what remains is not just wreckage of armor and splintered lances. It is a landscape of mutilation. Limbs severed cleanly by cannonballs lie yards from their owners. Torsos are half gone. Heads are missing. Blood soaks into the dust in wide, irregular stains that will fade with the next rain, but never completely leave. Victors pick their way through this, stepping over men who once laughed, argued, prayed. Yes, the Indian weapon humiliated the Mongol war machine. Yes, it helped keep a frontier from collapsing and forced an empire to recognize its limits. But none of that came free. The price was paid in burns and ruptured eardrums, in shattered chests and terrified animals, in minds that would never again see war as a clean contest of courage. Every technological leap in warfare writes its own ledger in bone. The controlled explosion that once lived in a clay tube in a Delhi workshop has, over the centuries, been magnified into artillery barrages, carpet bombings, and nuclear fireballs. At each step, strategists praised effectiveness. Philosophers worried about meaning. Ordinary soldiers and civilians absorbed the shock in their bodies. The Indian invention we've been following is no different. Behind the romance of underdogs inventing a way to stop the invincible Mongols, behind the elegance of its physics and the drama of its first use, there walks a procession of ghosts, gunners and riders, smiths and horses, all of whom paid so that thunder could be turned into a human tool. We've walked among the bodies and the blast craters. Now it's time to step back from the battlefield and duck into the spaces where thunder was first coaxed into iron. The forges of Delhi. Not the grand audience halls with carved stone and inlaid marble, the places where sultans posed for painters and poets. We're looking for the low, hot rooms behind them. Mud brick workshops that glow at night like small, artificial suns. Corridors where the air tastes of metal and ash. Where the rhythm of hammers drowns out courtly music. Here, the true architects of the Mongols' humiliation lived and worked. Their names rarely made it into chronicles. At best, a historian might jot a certain skilled artisan or master of fire and iron. Yet without them, no commander's genius, no king's courage would have mattered. Thunder, after all, does not shape itself. Imagine one of them. He might be the son of a blacksmith who once made horseshoes and plowshares, gradually pulled upward into more specialized work by the demands of war. Or he could be an immigrant craftsman from Central Asia or Persia, drawn by Delhi's wealth, bringing with him half-remembered stories of Chinese fire lances, then finding in India's saltpeter-rich soils the raw material to do something new. His day begins before the city fully wakes. He walks through alleys still cool from the night, past vendors setting up stalls, to the edge of the foundry quarter. There, workers are already stoking charcoal furnaces, bellows wheezing like tired beasts. Piles of iron blooms wait to be reheated and hammered. Clay molds for larger castings, carefully dried in the sun, line one wall like sleeping giants. First comes the haggling. A saltpeter merchant arrives, his hands permanently crusted white from handling the crystal. The engineer squats, pinches a sample. rubs it between his fingers, even tastes it, tongue searching for the telltale bitterness that marks purity. Too much dirt and the powder will fizzle instead of roar. Too impure and a king's cannon may whisper when it is supposed to shout. Prices are argued, weights are challenged, reputation is leveraged. Science here depends as much on supply chains and trust as on inspiration. Once the ingredients are secured, saltpeter, charcoal, sulfur, the alchemical part of the work begins. In one corner, under the eye of an older man with burned scars like a map across his arms, assistants grind components in stone mortars. Ratios are everything. They have no scales delicate enough to measure grams, but they have developed a feel. 3 measures of this, 2 of that, 1 of the third. They adjust based on humidity, on how the last batch burned. The resulting powder is not perfectly uniform, but good enough to be a consistent explosive, not just a temperamental flash. Meanwhile, in the heart of the workshop, the engineer turns his attention to the barrel. If it's to be wrought iron, strips are cut, heated to white heat and hammer welded around a mandrel, layer upon glowing layer, until a tube coalesces. Each seam is a potential failure. Each strike of the hammer must marry metals, not just flatten them. If it's to be cast bronze, the work shifts to clay and wax, to channels carved so molten metal can flow evenly, to anxiously watching for signs that a mold might crack or leak at the decisive moment. He does not have stress-strain graphs. He has something more visceral, memory of other barrels that split. He remembers the sight of jagged iron peeled back like a broken flower, the sickening knowledge that men once stood where that shrapnel now lies. So as he shapes, he constantly checks thickness with calipers, taps for hollow sounds that indicate voids, peers at the grain when he files off a test sliver. He calculates, in his own way, how much pressure this tube can bear. Nights, when the palace is quiet and musicians play for the elite, he lies awake doing his own kind of music in his head. If I thicken the breech by this much, I can give the new piece another scoop of powder. If I taper the muzzle slightly, I might gain a little range without too much extra strain. When a barrel is finally ready, the real trial comes. Out on a test ground beyond the city walls, the engineer watches as his creation is loaded for the first time. His stomach knots. On one side of him are gunners, murmuring bets on whether the tube will burst. On the other, a court official waits to report success or failure to higher powers who see only outcomes, not processes. The fuse is lit. If the barrel holds, if the ball leaps from the mouth with that satisfying gut-shaking thump and lands roughly where intended, a small, quiet joy flickers in the engineer's chest. He may not cheer out loud. He may simply nod, make a few notes to himself. Kick was too strong, reinforce carriage, and begin thinking of the next improvement. If it fails, if the test ends in smoke and screams, he will spend the next days sifting through twisted metal, trying to read in its fractures what went wrong. Failure for him is not abstract either. It has names and funerals. But it is also data that no one else can afford to ignore. He lives in a strange duality. On one hand, he is a mere artisan, expected to bow in the presence of nobles whose swords he has indirectly empowered. On the other, the fate of those nobles, whether their proud charges end in glory or in torn, bleeding heaps under cannon fire, rests invisibly on the choices he makes about alloy ratios and wall thickness. He has no access to what we would call a laboratory, no journals to publish in, no conferences. His peer review comes from other smiths' hard stares, from the unflinching judgment of a battlefield. His legacy will not be his name in a history book, but a line in a chronicle saying, "In those days, the Sultan's thunder was very great. Moonlight Science likes to talk about big ideas and sweeping patterns. But here, in the half-lit forge, those patterns condense into sweat on a man's brow, into the rhythm of a hammer striking hot metal, into the hiss of quenching water. These lost engineers of Delhi were scientists in every meaningful way. They asked how, they experimented, they learned from error, they predicted outcomes. With hammer, file, and flame, they altered the trajectory of empires, even if, when their work roared on the battlefield, someone else's banner got the credit. We've followed the iron from forge to field, watched it roar and split in rust. We've seen bodies fall and empires flinch. But if you've been listening closely, you may have sensed that the real story was never just about metal. It was about a decision. Think back to our opening scene. A Mongol horde thundering across a North Indian plain, certain of the world's rules. Horses are faster than men. Arrows outrange spears. Terror travels ahead of banners. The side that best masters speed, coordination, and courage wins. Delhi's rulers and artisans looked at that script and did something truly radical. They declined to read their lines. Instead of trying endlessly to field better horse archers, an arena in which the Mongols had centuries of cultural momentum, they chose to fight in a way the steppe had never rehearsed. They invited something dangerous and poorly understood into their arsenal. A black powder that could as easily blow up its users as their enemies. Tubes of iron that might split like rotten fruit under pressure. That choice was not inevitable. It was not encoded in geography or fate. It was a mental leap. It required accepting a few unsettling premises: that the world is not simply a stage for courage and fate, but a machine with levers, chemistry, acoustics, animal psychology, that you can pull if you can first find them. That tradition and honor must sometimes give way to experiment, even if experiment feels unclean. That the path to survival might lie through embracing something that makes battle uglier, less personal, less heroic. In other words, the true weapon Delhi deployed against the Mongols was a way of thinking that said, what if we change the rules? The iron tubes were just the visible tip of that iceberg. Under the surface, the real force at work was an emerging, rough-edged science. Alchemists tracking which mixtures of saltpeter and charcoal produced louder blasts. Smiths correlating wall thickness with survival rates. Commanders mapping invisible cones of fire in their heads. Philosophers wrestling with what it meant when a nobody with a match could decide the fate of a noble. Taken together, these were the first stirrings of a mindset we now take for granted. That knowledge, testable, repeatable, sometimes uncomfortable knowledge, can be used to bend power. When the Mongols met Indian cannon, two civilizations did not just clash in a conventional sense. Two epistemologies collided. On one side, an extraordinarily refined culture of mobility, marksmanship, and fieldcraft. On the other, a culture that, pushed to the brink, began to see value in tinkering with the underlying physics of warfare. The clash wasn't simply horse versus tube, arrow versus ball. It was tradition versus experiment, instinct versus model, the wisdom of the saddle versus the curiosity of the forge. Metal rusts. The barrels that terrified steppe horses have long since crumbled or sit inert in museums. The Delhi Sultanate itself eventually fell, absorbed into new polities with new banners and new thunder. Even the Mongol Empire, once so awe-inspiring, fractured into successor states, their myths dulled by time. What endures, radiating forward from that encounter, is the pattern. Over and over in later centuries, we see the same invisible weapon unsheathed. When European navies put cannons in broadsides and turned ships into floating math problems of angle and timing, They were not just building on metallurgy. They were doubling down on the idea that you could design battles rather than just fight them. When armies in World War I finally accepted that machine guns and artillery had made old maneuvers obsolete and painfully reinvented combined arms tactics, they were, belatedly, making the same mental shift. Even beyond war, this pattern underlies much of what we call modernity. Vaccination, electricity, rocketry, computing, all are instances where someone refused to accept the given frame of reality and instead asked, what if we harness this hidden property of the world? What if we use it to protect, to travel, to speak across distance, to think faster? The Delhi artisans and commanders who first turned fire into a line of force aimed at Mongol cavalry would not have recognized satellites or algorithms. But they would have recognized the posture behind them. An almost audacious confidence that the universe hides shortcuts, and that a human mind, armed with curiosity and a tolerance for risk, can find and exploit them. That posture is the real subject of Moonlight Science's story tonight. It is easy and satisfying to frame this tale as how one Indian weapon absolutely humiliated the Mongol Empire, as if it were just a clever trick, a historical gotcha. But the deeper twist is more unsettling and more hopeful. Whenever brute force meets knowledge, knowledge eventually wins, though never cleanly and never without cost. The gunners' burned hands, the horses' shattered legs, the Mongol veterans' shaken faith in their own invincibility. These were the immediate prices of that insight. The long-term reward was an expanded sense of what was possible, that you could look at a problem that seemed insurmountable, like a sea of fast horses and lethal archers, and instead of despairing or imitating, you could invent. In that sense, the real weapon in our story is already in your hands. Every time you see a system that looks unassailable, political, technological, environmental, and choose not just to push against it, but to understand its workings and search for leverage points, you are wielding the same blade those anonymous engineers of Delhi did. You are betting that insight can rewire power. The iron tubes are gone. The mindset that birthed them is not. So here we are again, back on a plain. The grass is waist-high, shivering slightly in a late evening breeze. Birds call. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor rattles along a dirt road. No banners, no armor, no hooves. Just an empty North Indian field that, if we could peel back the layers of time, would once have been loud enough to shake your bones. Close your eyes for a moment and let the quiet thin. Underneath it, if you've walked this whole journey with us, you might almost hear faint ghosts. The drumbeat of hooves, shouted commands, and half-forgotten tongues, the manic whinny of panicked horses. And then, cutting through it all, that first impossible sound, thunder on a clear day. It is easy to treat that sound as a relic, sealed in its century. It belongs, we tell ourselves, to an age of swords and turbans, of camel caravans and hand-ground powder. But the more we've traced its ripples, the harder it becomes to keep it quarantined there. Because the logic behind that blast never went away. It evolved. Today, the tubes that throw death are sleeker, longer, guided by computers. The Sauerkraut powder has been replaced by more refined propellants, the stones by machined alloys, the rough, carpentered carriages by stabilized, GPS-linked platforms. Missiles arc silently over horizons. Hypersonic glide vehicles promise to sprint through the upper atmosphere. Drone swarms buzz like mechanical locusts over battlefields we mostly see as pixelated thermal feeds. Yet, strip away the acronyms and the alloys, and the pattern is chillingly familiar. we are still finding ways to turn controlled bursts of energy into lines of force that leap across the in-between space faster than eyes can track. We are still trying to break not just the bodies of adversaries, but their cohesion and will, using noise, shock, surprise, and the careful engineering of fear. We are still, over and over, choosing to fight not on the old terms, but by changing the rules out from under whoever thought they understood them. That is why this old Indian story matters. It reminds us that the moment when fire first left the hearth and entered a barrel was not a quaint prelude to modernity. It was the beginning of a feedback loop we are still trapped in. Innovation manufacturing new vulnerabilities as fast as it creates new strengths. When Delhi's gunners first touched matched event, they made their city safer from Mongol charges. But they also made every soldier's body on that field more precarious, every horse's nerves more fragile, every ethical framework for honorable war more unstable. The same is true now, on a much larger scale. Each time a state fields a new missile system designed to pierce existing defenses, or an AI-driven targeting program meant to shave seconds off decision cycles, it buys itself a sliver of advantage and adds a new layer of fragility to a world already balanced on thin edges. Hypersonic weapons promise to outrun current interception. Autonomous drones threaten to saturate human operators' ability to respond. Somewhere, security analysts reassure themselves that these tools will deter conflict by making it too costly. Somewhere else, someone who feels cornered looks at the same tools and sees a way to finally flip the script. The story of how one Indian weapon humiliated the Mongol Empire is, at heart, a story about that double edge. On one side, it is inspiring. A society under immense pressure refuses to accept defeat as destiny. It thinks sideways, experiments, risks, and in doing so proves that no empire, however terrifying, is truly invincible. For anyone living in the shadow of seemingly unstoppable powers, political, economic, technological, that is a powerful message. Scripts can be rewritten. Rules can be changed. On the other side, it is a warning. Because every time we succeed at rewriting those rules with a new instrument of force, we don't just humble someone else. We humble ourselves. We discover that courage, skill, and even righteous cause can be ambushed by a device a world away. We find that our own bodies, our own cities, our own certainties are more exposed than we thought. In that sense, the real lesson of the Indian thunder tubes is not be the first to invent the next big weapon. It is, be honest about what each new way of projecting violence does to the fabric of our world. It widens the gap between cause and effect. It hands life and death power to fewer fingers and more algorithms. It makes it easier to kill from afar and harder to see the faces of those on the receiving end. It tempts us to treat war as a solvable engineering problem rather than as a human catastrophe to be prevented. Moonlight Science is not here to give you easy morals. History rarely offers those. But standing on this quiet field, with the echoes of Indian thunder and Mongol screams fading into the cricket song, we can at least ask better questions. When we marvel at a hypersonic test or a gleaming new missile defense system, are we also imagining the gunners huddled near their blast, the families who will one day live under its arc? The engineers lying awake at night, knowing a miscalculation could erase a city. When we talk about deterrence, are we thinking in the same way those Delhi commanders thought? That a terrifying noise might keep a predator at bay? Or are we forgetting how easily such noises can also stampede us into disasters we didn't foresee? The field is empty now. The iron is silent. But the mindset that once turned powder and pipe into a Mongol-breaking force is all around us. In our labs, in our doctrines, in our headlines. The question, as we leave this story, is whose terms we will choose to fight on next. Not just in war, but in every arena where power is contested. Will we keep reaching for louder thunder, trusting that it will always be on our side? Or can the same curiosity and courage that once invented new ways to kill be turned toward inventing new ways to step back, to de-escalate, to make the space between us less lethal? The embers of that first thunder are still glowing. What we do with their light is, uncomfortably, up to us. If this journey through forgotten forges and shattered myths moved you, you know what to do. Let the algorithmic thunder roll. Like, share, and subscribe to Moonlight Science. Not just for more tales of lost weapons and hidden histories, but for the deeper questions hiding under them. Because the past is not dead metal. It's a mirror, and tonight it has been pointed straight at us.